we will need to proceed. We do have a quorum, but I will text her. Let's see.
We missed you yesterday, Mr. Shipsky. It was a 3 Tesla day in the garage. You'd have made it 4.
She's running late, Esther, but she's trying to join.
Okay, I will be starting the webinar. It is 8:30. Good morning, everyone. Here we go.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. And thank you, Esther, again, for everything you're doing. I'm Robin MacArthur, and I want to gavel in today's final meeting for our November sessions. Today is Friday the 13th, November 13th of 2020. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to go straight into our agenda item for commission business. And as part of commission business, but in the grand scheme, I just really want to thank everybody. I've already thanked staff and all the participants for the RAC, but I just really want to thank my colleagues on the commission. You just bring so much passion and wisdom and focus to these housing conversations, these critical housing conversations. And I think it shows among the commission and staff, but I think it's a really good show to the outside world that we really care about these issues. We're willing to take the extra time to deliberate on them. I'm happy with the approach of waiting until December, even though it does require a special meeting on everyone's part. I'm excited about that prospect because I think this deserves a final look before we actually take action. So thanks for your patience yesterday with a full-on day on housing. And I'm really honored to serve with all of you. With that, I will turn it over to Budget and Management. We have Carol Bovet here today, our budget director, and she is going to give us an update on our budget. Jim did a little bit of yesterday morning, but Carol will give us all these wonderful specifics. She has her finger on the pulse of this stuff. So welcome.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. For the record, my name is Carol Bovet, and I'm the Administrative Services Manager for DLCD. And just want to give the Commission a report today on the meeting of the Budget and Management Subcommittee that took place on Tuesday of this last week. The financials review is at the top of was at the top of our agenda for the BAM meeting, and DLCD is doing relatively well given the situation that we have at this point. I think that most of you are aware that we are currently projecting, as far as our general fund budget through the remainder of this biennium ending June 30th, we're projecting currently an overspend. I would even add just a little bit of extra information on how we kind of look at our budget. Usually in most biennia, we have at times even a problem with having an underspend. And we have money that we sometimes have not been able to get through by the end of the biennium because of our very conservative budgeting. But in this biennium, we have, an overspend. So we have to really get detailed and careful about how we do our projections. The appropriation that we're most concerned about at this point is our main operating appropriation. And that is the appropriation in which we receive general fund that pays for all of our staff and services and supplies and keeps the lights on. And in that main appropriation, we're currently tracking an overspend of $145,000 and some change. The good news that goes with that bad news is that we are still anticipating a salary pot that would compensate the agency for union negotiated raises and step increases for all of our staff. And that at least is estimated to give us about $250,000 worth of general fund relief by the end of the biennium. So we are projecting an overspend currently, but I think that by the time that the salary pot monies are distributed, we should be okay for the biennium. We had multiple kind of positives and negatives that kind of built into the current projections that we have. On the positive side, we're receiving additional money to reimburse the agency for COVID-related expenditures. And the Department of Administrative Services is distributing out monies to state agencies based on the CARES appropriation that they receive from the federal government. We also found some reconciliation items, which meant though that our overspend stayed pretty close to the same as what it was in the prior month. But having said that, we have a terrific budget officer and she is keeping us on track. And at this point, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to resolve our projected overspend. In regards to the 21-23 budget development activities, I caught part of Director Rue's presentation yesterday, so the commission may be already generally aware, but we had our meeting to appeal the analyst recommended budget. That meeting was attended by people from the governor's office as well as the DAS chief financial office. I thought it was a very positive and productive conversation. And, you know, we're hoping that the cut to our core agency budget will be minimal. But at this point, we won't know until we see the governor's budget, which should come out really in the next few weeks. And we will know more then. I would just say, just for the purpose of the commissioners that may be interested in reviewing that document, I know Chair MacArthur will have to review the document before we release it. But as far as process, the governor's budget is slightly different. We basically receive the numbers from the governor's office when the official governor's budget is released. And after we receive those numbers, we do a little bit of analysis, really kind of to pin the details on top of the numbers that she came up with that are presented a little bit more generally. And we also put together a full document so that we're putting together all in context, all of the work that the agency hopes to do next biennium and how we're doing in the work that we have now. So I guess what I'm saying is that even after the governor's budget is officially released, it will be actually into January before the agency is completing, you know, our official documents that we can post to our website for all to review. But on that note, I'm not really sure there's a whole lot else to update. But I would just open up the report to any questions from the group.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Bovett? Don't.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Carol, thank you. It's a great update, and I think it's particularly timely given that we're going to talk about the policy agenda today, because obviously there's a direct correlation here between the agency's resources and the policy agenda. So timely, and that's great. I think it's great that the staff's going to get the salary pop that you have requested, and hopefully that comes through. Just given, it seems like every day here we see about the increasing cost of living, and unfortunately, great guest editorial in today's bulletin about. I mean, it's terrible, but it was well written about somebody who's in their early to mid 30s who's going to likely have to leave Bend because they just can't afford to live here. And it's the last thing we want to do is to lose the people that we already have. It's really, really tragic. So I'm really glad to hear that your agency is going to get that salary bump, because it's, of course, we want to get more staff back in the department to do more great work, but we certainly want to keep the people that are there today. So Absolutely. Thank you for the update. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lilac, and I appreciate your point that this conversation is connected to the policy agenda, but it's also really connected to item number 8, which is the fee, the recommendation for charging a fee to process Measure 49 claims. So that's kind of one of the underlying issues there that we need to keep in mind. Other questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, thank you very much, Carol. Appreciate your efforts.
Absolutely.
As well.
I hope you all have a good Friday.
You too. Thank you. So 2 other items on my list. During executive session later today, we are reviewing Director Rue's performance. And along those lines, back in, I think it was the September meeting, you all sort of appointed Commissioner Lilac and I to take charge of looking at the survey information and then coming to some conclusions with that, as well as some other information. And we met a couple of times, talked to an HR director, not the one that is in DLCD because she's on leave, but we talked to another person that was able to help us craft that. We sent that yes note, I think it was Wednesday, maybe it was yesterday morning. Anyway, recently we both sent it to you, the summary and discussion draft. And so we'll need an executive session to look at that. So if you haven't had a chance to find that in your inbox, please do, and make sure you have that ready for that conversation. The second sort of housekeeping issue, but not really, more than housekeeping, it's pretty important. I've connected with, I think, all of you, either by email or a direct conversation, that in January, I'll be asking for your support to make a change in the vice chair position. Katie Pearmine couldn't be here today, but she asked quite a while ago, to be honest, to step down as vice chair. She's got a lot of things going on in her life, and it was just a little bit too much to add this to it as well. Luckily and fortunately for us, she's willing to serve out her full first term. I'm excited about that. But I've talked to Anjali, Commissioner Halava, about taking that position, and she is willing to do that. And so I'm very excited about teaming up with her. But I just want to give you that heads up, and we'll be taking up that decision in January. It seemed more appropriate to do it when Katie could be here. So those are my updates, but this is commission business. And so do any other commissioners have things they want to bring up? Seeing no heads or thumbs up or anything, I think that concludes our commission business discussion, and we can go directly into agenda item 8, which is amended rule for Measure 49 claim review fee. And we have, I believe Sarah as well as Marvin Palmer, Mason, and Matt Krall. And maybe Gordon's going to join us for that conversation as well. I'm not sure which one is the one teeing it off. So staff, take it away.
Good morning, Chair MacArthur. I'm just looking, and I don't know if Sarah has made it onto the panel yet.
No, Matt, I don't see her on our attendees list or panelist list.
He was probably expecting us to be an hour late like we were yesterday on topics.
Well, we had thought it might be a little closer to 9, but I think she was going to be joining soon, so I thought she would be here.
Chair MacArthur, this is Kirsten, if I may. Matt, do you mind? I think Matt is trying to reach Sarah to bring her on, but I just can't help but celebrate the appointment of Commissioner Halava, the possible projected appointment of Commissioner Halava to the vice chair position. We as staff, and I think I speak for Director Rue there as well. This is an exciting moment, a historic moment, and Vice Chair Pearmine's really excited about it, and staff are really excited about it. So Commissioner Halava, thank you for coming into this, if that happens in January, and other commissioners. Certainly, I think, Chair MacArthur has a handle on this process with Jim, but I just wanted to say how excited we are from a staff perspective.
Thank you. It's really exciting. And Commissioner Paramine's not here, but I was going to thank her since we're talking about it. I think she's played a really critical role in thinking about equity and how equity influences the commission and the work of the department. And that I feel like that will be missed, but part of that has been helping to pave the way to make my position possible within the commission. So I'm really grateful to Commissioner Paramine for all her work so far. But I want to say that again when she's here also.
Yeah, I was definitely saving my comments for both her and you for January, but I appreciate, Kirsten, I think it's really important to acknowledge that Commissioner Hella was willing to do this, and I'm thrilled, and I'm glad that staff is thrilled, and I think the commission is really well served. So
you could probably thank the RAC process. You know, if it was pre-RAC process, I'd be like, what? And then after RAC, I'm like, that's all it takes? Oh. Oh, RAC was intense. So yeah,
your workload will go down.
I know. So yeah.
Great. We have Matt and Sarah that have joined us.
Great. So Matt, you'll kick it off, it sounds like.
Sure. Good morning, Chair MacArthur, members of the commission. While Sarah Marvin is bringing up our slideshow, I guess I should introduce myself for the record. Matt Kroll, part of your staff here at the department. I'm going to share a few opening thoughts, and then Sarah will kick off with most of our background facts and data to really set up the policy deliberations. And also we do have Palmer Mason here with us, who has been involved in this process, and we'll chime in on a couple of key points. And I think we may have some reasons to call upon our Steve Shipsey on some of the questions here too. So I'm glad to see that he's here. I want to just recognize as we start off that this is in many ways a tough time to talk about adding fees. We are facing a COVID-19 pandemic. We are facing fires and recovery, and that's hard. We're facing budget cuts at DLCD, and that makes it hard for us to be able to respond in the way that we would want to, and to be able to absorb some of the things that in other situations we might be able to. But even with all of that, it's our job to be implementing what the legislature has done, and the legislature has set up a couple of, you'll hear about the different pieces here. They set up the claims process for people who feel that they're the just compensation, the Measure 49 as we commonly call it, although it's now in statute, so it's just part of our statute. And then there is the more recent House Bill 2225 that we'll mention just a little bit today, because that is in some ways the immediate reason why we need to talk about this fee, but it is not the only reason that this fee could be used in the future as the future unfolds. So we're here to implement what the legislature set up, and we're bringing you a proposal so that we can recover the costs of doing that as the legislature set that up to be. And that I think frames up our discussion for today. So, oh, and I would be remiss if I did not thank Commissioner Lilac. He presented us with some very good set of questions ahead of time. And so that's always helpful when commissioners ask us those questions. Commissioner Lilac, I hope that you will recognize at least a few of these slides that are directly answering some of those more factual questions you posed. Some of the questions you posed are some more policy level, and I think those are questions that you will ask and discuss and deliberate here. And so I hope you don't feel left out that we didn't have a slide answering every one of your questions, but I certainly appreciate it. It's very helpful to us to know ahead of time.
Chair MacArthur, if I can just say thank you very much, Matt. And I just wasn't sure what the protocol was, if I had kind of developed some questions without drawing any conclusions prior to this agenda item, just to share them with staff so that to help prepare. But in any event, thank you. I wasn't sure how to go about that. And
I think you went about it the right way. And I think I would encourage we can't talk about it as a quorum outside of this, but you were actually making a direct email to Matt and team. So I think that I think you might have CC'd me, or I saw it somehow, but I really appreciated your articulation of the issues that you were thinking about. And that, as Matt said, it really does help staff to be able to be prepared to try to answer those questions. So thanks to Matt and staff for doing that as partly in this conversation.
Just double checking my list. I think that is everything that I needed to say at the beginning here. So I think it is time that we actually get into the substance here with Sarah Marvin.
Okay, first, for the record, I'm Sarah Marvin, the urban planner, not the Measure 49 specialist. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I need to ask, can you see it? Because I'm not sure what you are seeing.
Yes, we see, it says item 8, Measure 49 claim review fee rulemaking. Do you, and then there's
Okay, great. I've got a new setup and I'm not entirely certain how it's going to work. So I'm going to, does this advance to the next slide?
on overview now, yes.
Okay, so we are going to give you a pretty factually strict staff presentation that for 30 minutes, and that will be followed by public testimony and commission deliberations. And our recommended outcome is to adopt amendments to Oregon Administrative Rule 660-041-0520 to establish a review fee for new Measure 49 claims. And I'm not sure how many people might be watching in. We ask people to please sign up to testify. Esther, maybe you can tell me if I need to hold this slide up for long enough for people to write this down. Do people online already have this information?
So Esther did, at yesterday's meeting, at the beginning of yesterday's meeting, she mentioned this, and I think it's general knowledge that
Okay.
the website and this link, they don't have to write down this link necessarily. They just go to the DLC website.
They can go to the website and click it. Okay.
Thank you for your
All
thought.
right. So we're going to just give you a quick background of Measure 49, the proposed fee and rules, and we have a couple of other issues to discuss that were raised by Commissioner Lilac and others that came after the RAC meetings. So we'll put those at the end. So we'll start with, I'm sorry for, this is, your slideshow is moving and mine is not. So if you could hold on for just a moment.
The slide we there, if that's helpful, is called historical claims.
Yeah, so I realize now that one of my screens is advancing and the other isn't. So I'm going to be clicking twice here. Okay, so this rulemaking is to establish a fee to cover the costs of reviewing new Measure 49 claims. We did a history of Measure 49 at the rulemaking initiation, so I won't repeat that here. But due to the fact that there are two distinct types of Measure 49 claims, a brief explanation of these claims is required first. Measure 37 passed in 2004. Measure 49 passed in 2007, replacing Measure 37, and it created two types of Measure 49 claims. The first type that most people are familiar with is former Measure 37 claims that we refer to here as historical claims. Most people think of these claims when they hear the name Measure 49 claims. These claims went through supplemental review under Measure 49, and all of them were completed in 2011. So this rulemaking, the proposed fee, does not apply to any of these historical claims. And I just have an image of what these claims look like. This is what people are familiar with, Measure 37, final order and homesite authorization reviewed under Measure 49. These are not affected by this rulemaking. So now I have to, I'm really sorry about this, but now what are you seeing on your screen? You're not.
We still see the historical
Yeah.
slide.
I don't know why this isn't working, but we'll try. Darn it. This is not advancing.
Well, you've also done a really nice job in the staff report. So I think we could probably follow even if we don't have the visual cues. So we're happy to have you continue without the slides if that is going to work for you.
Okay, now do you see it? I'm sorry.
New claims, yes, we do.
Okay. Yeah. This is our new world, isn't it? All right, 2 different presentations at the same time. 2 different fingers. I think I've got it now. Any state agency that, all right. Okay, now we're on the same page. We both have new claims. Okay. The proposed fee does apply to new claims. New claims are those that are for land use regulations that were enacted after January 1st, 2007. A claimant may qualify for compensation if their claim meets certain criteria. The new land use regulation must have been enacted after the owner acquired the property. It must meet the definition of a land use regulation under Measure 49. It must restrict a residential use or a farm or forest practice. It must have reduced the fair market value of the property as demonstrated by dual appraisals, providing the value of the property 1 year before the land use regulation was enacted and 1 year after the land use regulation was enacted. And it must have been enacted within the past 5 years. So here we go. You move forward, right? No, it's just not. I thought I had this working for you.
Sarah and Chair MacArthur, if I could, this is Kirsten. Matt, could I ask you to bring up the show and run it for Sarah, please? I assume Sarah, it's on SharePoint, DLCD.
It is on SharePoint, and I think at this point.
Yep, we'll just pause and let Matt bring it up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
Everyone take a glass of water.
I've known PowerPoint to be tricky and Zoom on a good day, Sarah, so. Yeah.
This was working last night.
That is one of the inevitable quotes that would follow an experience.
And
I tried it before the meeting, yes, right? Thank you for trying it before the meeting.
And I also have total empathy for you, Sarah. I think I had to chair the last one whole afternoon by my phone in July when my internet went out. So I have a lot of empathy for you.
I was there for that. Matt, we're on potential for new claims now. And I should stop sharing, shouldn't I?
Yeah, Sarah, you can just watch Zoom and pay attention, attend to Matt's slides and direct him accordingly. Thank you.
I am, okay. Just finding anything. Stop sharing, yes. Have I stopped sharing now?
You know what, Sarah? Matt is sharing, and so I'd ask you just to go to your Zoom application and follow what he has on the screen, and he has potential for new claims on. I might take this opportunity to just let Matt know that Steve Shipsey does need to leave the meeting at 9. Gordon is on, and if there's any procedural matters that need to be addressed, of course we could come back, but we don't expect any issue concluding this agenda item in Steve's absence. Thank you.
I think you can go ahead, Sarah. I've got my screen.
Yeah.
Good. So.
I am just trying to get my slide.
Sarah, again, if you could just watch Zoom, I would appreciate it. He's got the slide up.
Yeah. So we're on potential for new claims.
Correct.
Any state agency that enacts a land use regulation that is not exempt by Measure 49 is subject to new claims. Restrictions on residential use would generally go to DLCD. Restrictions on farm and forest practices would generally go to Oregon Department of Agriculture and of Forestry. Only DLCD is authorized to establish the fee, and DLCD is the gateway for all state claims and would collect the fee for other state agencies. There have not yet been any new claims filed with the state. We do expect new claims to be filed with DLCD for House Bill 2225 in the very near future. Advanced slide. Statutory authority. The legislature and voters authorize public entities, including DLCD, to establish a fee to cover the cost of reviewing claims. This authorization is found in ORS 195-312. Next slide. Staff assembled a rulemaking advisory committee. The RAC consisted of representatives from the home builders, private property owners, agricultural interests, timber interests, planning and environmental advocacy groups, and the role of the RAC was advisory to staff. We held 2 RAC meetings, and the fundamental purpose was establishing a fee amount, and we came up with new revisions to the proposed rule to ensure that our fee remained accurate over time. Next slide. We will start with how we came to a proposed fee amount. The point of this diagram is to show you the complexity of reviewing a Measure 49 claim and where the bulk of costs would come in. That the biggest part is DOJ consultation throughout almost every step of the process, from completeness to the final order. And also the second biggest part is an appraiser, both in issuing an initial desk review for the 2 appraisals that the claim has, and for follow-up when often those appraisals need additional work. And the appraiser needs to be contracted early enough in the process that we can complete the claims by the 180-day deadline. DLCD staff must cover many administrative tasks, but the bulk of work is in this iterative process between DOJ and DLCD of reviewing the claim, writing preliminary evaluation, reviewing the follow-up to that, and writing a final order. Next slide. So the cost factors that go into making a claim either very, very high in expense or potentially lower, although we haven't ever seen a very low claim, are the complexity of the claim and the complexity of the land use regulation. So a claim that's going to be in the high range is going to have complex legal issues, multiple land use regulations, multiple properties and owners, complex or errors in the appraisal, legal follow-up required, appraisal follow-up required, and even the compensation can be complex. An extremely low claim that we haven't seen in our experience would have no legal issues. A simple land use regulation that clearly does or does not qualify for Measure 49 compensation, a simple property configuration and a simple ownership that clearly does or does not qualify, a simple appraisal, no follow-up required, and very clear compensation or even denial. Next slide. So the breakdown of the costs that go into these different levels of difficulty, we have from our former Measure 30, the historical claims that I was talking about before. There was a subset of these historical claims called Section 7 claims, and these were virtually identical to what new claims going forward are. They require this dual appraisal. And I was trying to think if there's, and the other thing that's identical is the way that compensation is figured out from that appraisal. And those are things that take a lot of extra analysis. the land use regulations for a Section 7 claim were not different from other historical Measure 49 claims. And because we had 5,000 of those claims to go through, all with similar, the same group of land use regulations, we were able to get the costs of reviewing those claims down to a pretty well-oiled machine. So the costs that I'm showing you here are based on those costs that we paid back, with updated, the numbers are updated to 2020, but these are based on claims that we did from 2008 to 2011. And that's why the historical is there. So a high Section 7 claim, most of the costs, as you can see, would be from the legal analysis and the appraisal. There's no difference in this table for costs from DLCD staff because unfortunately we didn't have hard data to go on. DLCD purged their records a while back, whereas DOJ was able to give us actual costs for legal. So a high complexity claim with those factors that were on the previous slide would come to around $20,000. Then most of those Section 7 claims actually fell into what I call a normal group. And there were no lows, but the normal group came to around $14,000. So what we're really talking about from what we learned from the past is that the most likely total amount that we would be seeing is around $14,000. And again, that was with a well-oiled machine. We don't have that machine now. We don't even have one staff person working on Measure 49. In the RAC, we attempted to see if we could get fees lower. How might you in the future have lower fees or lower costs? And that's why this is, we have these two hypotheticals. The first is the normal type of claim, the normal complexity if we had a lot of them and we could contract with an appraiser, we could get a lower appraisal fee at maybe a standard flat rate appraisal fee. And that gives us a total of around $12,000. And the low in here is very hypothetical. We've never seen a claim this simple, but if we could, maybe some future land use regulation is just incredibly simple and fits that criteria from the first slide, we could potentially see a cost of around $5,000. Next slide. Oh, I should say, based on those numbers, we are proposing a flat fee of $12,500 for new Measure 49 claims. And that was based on the average between the extreme low that we haven't seen before and the high that we have seen. So after we spent most of our time in the RAC talking about the fee and how costs fit into that and how DLCD could cover part of the cost of reviewing these claims. Then and that was something that we included for you in the rulemaking initiation. We since then have come up with 4 more revisions that we would like to make to the rule. One of them is the adjustment for inflation. And we went with the RAC's recommendation of an inflation index for Western cities that was established, I believe, by, well, there's another state agency that uses this one and we copied it. And that is the reason we picked this is because the costs of reviewing claims are going to be based on costs around Salem, Oregon. So this new amendment is Section 5B in the rule. Next slide, please. The second new amendment is a method to adjust for actual costs. So we do have lots of hard data on how much it costs the department and DOJ to review claims that are virtually identical to these new claims, and claims that were based on a whole lot of different types of land use regulations. but we also don't know what the future might hold. And we want to make sure that a fee is always accurate and is not above what we think it will actually cost us to review claims. So the RAC went over several potential options for doing this. Ultimately, we decided that establishing hard data on how much it costs to review new claims would be the best way to ensure that the fee stays accurate. So the new revision is in section 5C and reads, within 6 months of the end of each fiscal biennium, the LCD will determine the average cost incurred by the state to review claims from the prior biennium. If the average cost is higher or lower than the existing fee, then DLCD will submit the calculations and proposed rule amendment to revise the fee to LCDC. Next slide, please. A third proposed amendment is what we're calling an escape hatch, a refund for early exit. In the past, well, actually currently, we've seen denials for new Measure 49 claims coming out of both Tillamook County and the city of Eugene. And my experience from Section 7 claims, there may be claimants who have not thoroughly researched what it takes to have a valid claim and qualify for relief. So we're giving claimants 3 weeks to possibly develop buyer's remorse and get out if they find out after they've submitted the claim that this is probably not going to work for them. If a claimant does submit a claim and withdraws within 21 days before DLCD has invested significant resources into the review, the fee, all of the fee would be refunded except for a base of $1,000. And this is in section 6 of the rule. Next slide, please. And the final, this isn't something that we discussed in the RAC, but it was caught for some reason. Well, I shouldn't say for some reason, probably made a lot of sense at the time, but the rule requires claims to be submitted by hard copy, either by snail mail or coming in and delivering it. And the world has changed since then, and we would like to remove that prohibition to submitting electronically. It will make it easier for claimants to submit claims, and it'll also make it easier for DLCD to review them. And that is the end of the changes that we are proposing to the rule. Next slide, please. Some other issues related have come up in the RAC and outside of the RAC. With Measure 49, there's always something else, and we'd like to cover 2 of those in the presentation today. And there will be many more questions that you will have, and we have, I think, plenty of time to take those in the deliberations. So the other issues that we're presenting here are dual waivers and the fiscal impact statement. Next slide. Probably anybody who was around during Measure 37 will know what I'm talking about, but probably most people do not know what dual waivers are. So dual waivers are when a land use regulation is enacted at both the state level and the local level. And by statute, a public entity can only waive its own land use regulations. So for example, with HB 2225, both the state had to adopt rules for it, and the local government will be revising their ordinance, and that constitutes 2 different enactments. And even though they'll probably be mostly the same and have the same effect on claimants, we're not allowed to waive the local government's regulations, and they're not allowed to waive ours. And this was the same under Measure 37, and we got a handle on it. We coordinated with the local government, we shared information, and that made it much easier for the claimant and for both agencies to get through a claim. So that's how the department plans to handle this situation, is to continue coordinating like we have in the past. And because these are Section 7, or sorry, they're like the Section 7 claims from prior Measure 49, the most expensive parts of hiring a contractor to review appraisals, we can give that information to the counties, as well as the legal analysis of the land use regulation that was enacted. So we believe that we can hand over quite a bit of the work to a local government to take on their portion of reviewing a claim. I and apparently Commissioner Lilac had the same idea, surveyed counties' Measure 49 filing fees to see how this might affect claimants. Most counties are not thinking about Measure 49 filing fees. They haven't enacted any. They still have their, if anything, they have their former Measure 37 fees, which were nominal. I was able to find fees ranging from explicitly $0 up to a base fee of $150 with the county charging the claimant for a full cost by the end of the claim. And since we would be sharing all of our information, the legal analysis and the appraisal reviews, we could help the county keep that down to a very minimal level. And that is the end of explaining dual waivers. Next slide, please. And either Matt or Palmer are going to talk about the fiscal impact statement.
I think I'll invite Palmer, since it's legislative arena.
Yeah, good morning, Chair MacArthur and Commissioners. Palmer Mason, Senior Policy Advisor at DLCD. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the issue here is some of the stakeholders and members of the Rule Advisory Committee expressed concern that DLCD didn't indicate on a fiscal impact analysis for House Bill 2225 that we would be going forward with the Measure 49 processing fee. And to give you a little bit of context, as a bill moves through the legislature, as it moves through a policy committee, so in this case, this particular bill, which relates to forced template dwellings, was being considered by House Agriculture and Land Use. The practice is in the legislature that the Legislative Fiscal Office, so that's the professional staff that works for the appropriations committees, ask that a bill go through a fiscal impact analysis, and that indicates whether the bill needs to move on to a Ways and Means Committee. And of course, Ways and Means Committees are the committees where the legislature decides whether to appropriate any money for the purpose of that bill. So in this case, the concern that was raised is that the department didn't indicate in that fiscal impact analysis that, again, there would be a Measure 49 fee. But I think where we disagree is that's not the purpose of the LFO fiscal impact analysis. The question that is asking is, does this bill need to move on to a Ways and Means Committee? And it would only do that if there was a reason why the agency couldn't pay for the staffing or cover the costs that are associated with that bill. In this case, we had an existing statute that predated this bill into 2019 session, which would allow us to charge the fee that Sarah is talking about now. And because we could cover our costs, there's no reason to send the bill on to Ways and Means. There's no reason for the legislature to have to appropriate additional funds. We had the ability to pay for the work, or in this case, pay for the claims, process the claims. So it's kind of a insider baseball question, but some of the stakeholders raised it, both those participating on the RAC, as well as in some of the public testimony. So I think in the presentation, we wanted to try to address it. I'll make one last comment and see if there's any questions. I will agree with those stakeholders that in hindsight, the better practice for DLCD would have been to mention that there would have been a fee. That wouldn't have changed the fiscal impact analysis, and it wouldn't have sent the bill on to a Ways and Means Committee. But I wish we had indicated that a fee was likely to result from this particular piece of legislation. I own that one. I had just started the department. I didn't know what Measure 49 was. I didn't know what a forced template dwelling was. And so I didn't fully understand the implications. But in hindsight, I wish that we had indicated that on the fiscal. Again, it wouldn't have changed anything. about what the fiscal really says, but that would have been better had we been able to do that. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for Palmer? Don't see anyone. Okay. Thank you, Palmer.
Next slide. Oh, sorry.
Were you going to say some more? I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I think that concludes what we had as prepared. So it would be, if there were any clarification questions at this point, or ready to take testimony at the pleasure of the chair and commission.
Great. Well, let's ask for, thank you, Matt and Sarah. We'll ask for clarification questions from my fellow commissioners. And I might just turn it over to Commissioner Lilac first, since you took the time and energy to read this in advance and send your questions to staff. Are there, separate from the policy perspective, because we want to get input from the public on that, did you feel like your questions have been answered?
Well, thank you, Chair MacArthur. I guess I do look forward to hearing from the public, and I hope they testify. I guess my question is, because I certainly understand that the department needs to cover these costs, and as you said, there was a direct relationship between the budget overview this morning and this item, and I failed to mention that. So my question to the department then is absent the fee, or absent a fee that is not full recovery, how would the department pay for these costs? And I understand that and I really appreciate the information that was provided. It was exactly what I asked for, the breakdown of the fees, just to have a better understanding of what fees are necessary to cover staff costs versus the appraisal versus DOJ. And I understand that those, for the staff, that's really a choice you make, whether you allocate your resources to this or to something else. But the other costs are direct costs you're paying to DOJ or to the appraisal, to the appraiser for the appraisal. So, my question is, how would the department pay for those fees those costs absent a fee?
So may I respond?
Please do.
We would have to take it from somewhere else, Commissioner. So as Sarah mentioned, we do not currently have a Measure 49 specialist. Because of staff cuts, Sarah is taking over as Mid-Willamette Valley Regional Rep, particularly with fire recovery and a range of other issues. We have more than enough work that needs to get done in terms of fire recovery. And I only raise this as an example. When we're looking at a number per application in the range of $10,000, that's a lot of money around here. And that means that somebody else would not get the service that we seek to provide. We would simply have to take people doing other things to put into process claims, and because there's no other alternative, there is no other money to be had.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, if I can just ask one other question, is how did the department pay for the prior Measure 37 claims when you had up to 5,000 claims? Were those budgeted by the legislature?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we had a staff of nearly 30 people.
Okay.
There was a general fund allocation, both for staff and for legal support. And those 30 people are now, of course, gone.
And,
right.
And I can add to that in addition, we also charged a fee for some of those claims.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. I was just trying to understand the difference between that period and where it is now. And I assume that, of course, that the legislature funded those 30 positions. And
yes,
so that was,
yeah.
And in this case, unless I'm missing something, the legislature hasn't provided another allocation of funding for additional staff to process these, or to pay for the appraisals, or to pay to subsidize your costs to DOJ. I'm just seeking that I understand that correctly.
Yeah, and they did put the in statute that DLCD could impose a fee.
Thank you. Probably my last question is just there's, and I look forward to hearing from the testimony, but there just seems to be from the Oregon Property Owners Association and realtors that they question the amount of the fee, and I think you've addressed that. So I look forward to hearing their testimony and understanding the differences of opinion. Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Commissioner Warren, you have a question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair MacArthur, and thanks staff for the presentation here. This is just kind of a general understanding of how both Measure 49 would work with this fee. So I guess the question is, does Measure 49 have an avenue available where the homeowner could recoup the cost of this fee once they've gone through the process and been approved?
Recoup the cost?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by that actually. So you mean?
So sorry. So my understanding is that Measure 49 is basically an avenue for property owners to recoup the loss they sustained due to new legislation, right? So is there a way that Measure 49 would help to offset the cost of this fee? So say they go through the process, they pay the fee, and it's approved that their claim, stands. Can that be written into the compensation for these folks? Or is it just it's just the cost of going through the process? Does that make sense?
Gordon, is that a question for you to answer?
I think that does make sense. And I think I can provide some information, may not fully answer it. The statute as it stands right now, it does say that the cost to the applicant of getting their appraisal can be included in their claim for what their loss was. If a agency like DLCD were to then decide to pay them their loss, we would pay them for that appraisal. However, I think it's highly unlikely that any agency is going to pay a claimant for the loss, because the statute also provides that instead of paying them directly, writing a check to the claimant, you can waive the land use regulation to the extent necessary to compensate them. So in most cases, that would mean you get to do whatever it was you could have done. I'm oversimplifying a bit there, but that's what it would work out to in most cases. So in that situation, though, there is no direct payment to the claimant, so there is nothing. It's just simply they get to go ahead and build that house that they were planning to build.
And just to add on to that very quickly, they get an asset. They get an asset of a developable plot of land, and that is their compensation.
I'd like to add that the cost of them, the appraisal, it's actually not just the appraisal that they can include in the cost. It's the whole application, but it's only up to $5,000. But that does go into the compensation of determining how much development they can do on the property. So it can move the appraisal to a higher level where they could get maybe 2 home sites instead of 1. So it is factored into the compensation, whether it's monetary or home sites.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Any other questions from commissioners before we go to public comment? Not seeing any. I'll have to ask for guidance from Esther on the list. You may have sent it to me this morning and I haven't printed the list of folks that have signed up to testify. So as you kind of get that lined up, I guess in reading the really good written testimony, I thought, from a couple of folks, and we might hear from those same folks today. It seemed to me, in my mind anyway, at this point, that there wasn't necessarily an objection to charging a fee. There is a lot of testimony on, written testimony on how to get to that fee to reflect actual costs. And I would think that the department and property owners share the same goal on that front. For example, if the charge is $12,500, let's say now, we might be overcharging a property owner or underpaying DLCD staff if it deviates from that figure. So I'm just wondering, we can talk about this when we come back, but I'm wondering if there's ways to get closer to the actual fee for a particular application, given the spread of costs that was shown on that one chart. So that's my general thought at this point, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Jeremy Rogers and Ellen Miller. So Mr. Rogers, thank you for your written testimony, and we're glad you're here today. And we're going to have, I think, 3 minutes each for the two of you.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair MacArthur and commissioners. And before I get into this, I just wanted to thank you again for your tremendous work yesterday and over the course of the last year on the housing work. It's just phenomenal and groundbreaking, and I'm so excited about it. And I think Oregon is going to be a model for the nation. So thank you for that. Onto this issue, we do have general concerns about a high fee discouraging people from exercising their rights under Measure 49 as a general issue, but we do recognize that the statute does authorize you to charge a fee. And so I want to focus my comments on making the fee comply with the statute. So the statute in question is ORS 195312 sub 4, and that limits the fee that the agency can charge to not more than the actual and reasonable cost. And this is a sort of a term of art that's used throughout the ORSs, and it's a different phrase than is used when the legislature intends to mean something different than actual costs. So the legislature will often use estimated costs or average costs or other phrase when they mean that, and they use the term actual costs when they mean actual costs. And I'm quite familiar with the term actual and reasonable costs because it's very prevalent in the landlord-tenant statutes, which I deal with quite a bit through my work. And like, for example, when a tenant makes a repair to their home because of a habitability issue that the landlord hadn't taken care of, they can deduct from their rent the actual costs of the actual and reasonable cost of the repair. And that really requires them to only deduct the amount they actually incurred, they actually spent. And we see this also in the context of land use. So for example, ORS 197.380 requires each city and county to establish an application fee for an expedited land division. And it says to set it at the level calculated to recover the estimated full costs of processing the application based on the estimated average cost of such applications. And then that statute says, go back later and review and adjust the fee based on actual experience. So that's an example of the legislature sort of instructing agencies to do what this agency is trying to do here, but that's not the command that the legislature gave here. Here, the legislature said actual and reasonable costs. It didn't say anything about estimated costs, and it said not more than. And so unless there's a way to track actual costs, to intentionally set the fee below what you know the actual cost will be so you never go over it, which is what the statute prohibits, or some sort of refund provision reflecting actual costs after costs have been paid if they went over that, then we don't believe that the rule will be in compliance with the statute. So looks like my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Questions? Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. And Jeremy, thank you. I don't think I had ever heard that clear explanation between the estimated average cost and actual and reasonable cost before. That was, yeah, that was certainly very helpful. I guess my question is, do you think, and I haven't asked the department this, and so I'll be interested in their response later, but is it reasonable to have a deposit format, as you suggested, potentially a deposit that they pay, and then if there's a refund, then that is provided with that? And I understand there's a cost to the time tracking and coordinating with DOJ to find out how much they spent, things of that nature. Would that type of a fee by a deposit be a reasonable consideration?
You know, I don't know precisely. I mean, it would be much closer to compliance with the statute. I think that the statute says the fee should be set at not more than actual and reasonable. So there is that kind of direct connection with what the fee is. But at least if you were doing it that way with a deposit and then a refund, you'd be getting much, much closer to what the statute requires. So, technically, legally, I don't know how that would play out if it was challenged, but it would be much closer.
Thank you.
Other commissioners have questions? Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you very much.
And now we have Ms. Miller from the Home Builders.
Good morning, Chair MacArthur, members of the commission. Ellen Miller here with the Home Builders. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I also want to echo what Jeremy said about yesterday. Very impressive. I am very excited about what is going to happen there. But regarding the Measure 49 fee, application fee, I of course understand the agency's budget is extremely lean and the agency has the authority to set this fee. However, we have two issues with how this fee could potentially impact residential development in the future. Our first issue is with the housing impact statement. It states that state land use regulations almost never restrict residential development on residential parcels within cities' urban growth boundaries or unincorporated areas. And we agree under the current regulations and laws that we would not anticipate the need to file Measure 49 claims. Many of our members don't have that current need. But nothing in current law prohibits restrictions on residential development in the future. And this fee would apply to an applicant in that situation. So I feel that the housing impact statement should at least indicate that. The second issue I have is regarding the actual legislative process or the inside baseball that Palmer presented. If what Palmer said is true, then if there were future land use regulations that were introduced at the legislature and this fee had been adopted by commission, then the legislation and the legislative record would not be required to include the fiscal impact of the Measure 49 claims. And that's concerning to us just from a transparency issue that that policymakers would not fully see the cost of the potential regulation for homeowners. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions, and thank you again for the time to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Questions? Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. I guess it's either a question to Ellen or to the staff. Is it possible to change the housing impact statement to include this language? Is that a relatively straightforward change to make? And I'm just curious about perspectives both from Palmer and Ellen.
So this is Palmer. I can't speak to the housing statement. I think Sarah will need to speak to that. I would like to respond to Ellen's concern about transparency, and I could do that whenever that's appropriate.
Please do that. I was going to ask you to respond to her comments anyway.
Okay, so I think Ellen's right. I think the legislature needs to know whether there are going to be potential fee impacts when they're considering legislation, and that was my point, that in hindsight, I wish, knowing more, which I didn't at the time because it was brand new to DLCD, I would have made sure that the fiscal impact for House Bill 2225 would have been more clear on that point, would have spelled out there would have been a fee. But my point is, and I'll stand by this because I've done hundreds of fiscal impact analysis at DEQ and quite a few now at DLCD, is that's not what the legislature isn't asking. Is there expense impact? Will agencies incur expenses? Yes, they are asking that question, but what they're really asking is, does those set of expenses bring on the need for new staff or new revenue sources or anything like that that requires a bill to go to Ways and Means so the legislature can decide whether they appropriate money or not? That's what the real point of a fiscal impact analysis at the legislature, at the Capitol, is for. But I agree absolutely with Ellen's, I think, her real point, which is policymakers at the Capitol need to know if agencies are going to either require new fees or adjust current fees where they have the authority to do so, the policymakers need to know that information, even if a bill doesn't get referred to Ways and Means. And I agree with that. And there again, I'll admit that we should have done a better job.
Thank you, Palmer. Any other questions from commissioners for Ms. Miller?
I just didn't, Chair. I just didn't understand the second part of her. I was confused a little bit by the residential comment, and I was hoping she could just review the part that she was talking about.
Ellen, you kind of review the point about maybe a loss in housing is what your point was, or some kind of stifling effect on housing. I didn't quite get it either.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur and Commissioner Halova for the question. Are you asking about potential future regulation and how it could potentially impact housing?
Yeah, you made some reference to currently the people you represent don't have issue with this because of the current, so in the future. I didn't understand that.
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding, this rulemaking was really initiated because of the forest template bill that passed in 2019. And so we don't anticipate that many of our members are going to be impacted by potential Measure 49 claims because most of our members are building inside urban growth boundaries. But I would like to see the housing impact statement to say that there is nothing that prohibits future regulations on housing development. And if there were future regulations on housing development and Measure 49 claims would be required for those property owners to be able to realize the development potential of those lots, then they would be subject to this fee also in the future. So under the current law and current regulations, we don't anticipate a significant impact, but there is the potential, and it is rare. And after, the conversations we had yesterday, it seems almost impossible that we would have any statewide regulations that would limit residential development. But if there was, this potentially could impact the cost of a house being built on a 6,000 square foot lot, a 1,200 square foot structure. So it's just making sure that the record reflects accurate potential housing impact.
So would just to follow up then, if I may, Commissioner Halaba. So Ellen, wouldn't that information, should that information be provided at the time that some new regulation is being proposed, as opposed to sort of this generalized statement about that would affect all future regulation? It seems like the impact should occur at the time of consideration in whatever body, whether it's the legislature or this body, on something that would affect housing.
Chair MacArthur, that is absolutely correct. And that is my second point about what happens at the legislature. We do think that at that time it should be very clear. And I agree with most of what Palmer said, but I do still think that it needs to go through a potential Ways and Means process because you do have a revenue source and it's fees. And so that revenue source needs to be considered at Ways and Means, and the agency's limitations need to be adjusted accordingly. So again, sorry, that's kind of inside baseball for legislature. This adopting the fee today is for not only Measure 49 claims today, but it would be Measure 49 claims in the future. So unless this fee would only apply to current laws and rules, and they would be, I don't know how you would, it would sunset if for any future regulations, if it wouldn't apply to future regulations, then I agree that it should only reflect the potential impact today. But it appears to me that this fee would apply to any future regulations and applications as well, or I should say future applications as a result of adopted regulations in the future. But I would love to be corrected if that's not the case.
Thank you. I appreciate the fuller explanation. Did that answer your question, Commissioner Holova? Other questions from commissioners? I don't see anyone's hand up for Ms. Miller. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
And seeing nobody else on the list to testify today. Is that correct? Great. Shaking of head. Thank you. Appreciate that. So why don't we close public comment and then go to final deliberation on this. So commissioners.
Chair, could I ask a question of the staff?
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if they could respond to this actual and reasonable versus estimated comment that was made.
Commissioner Holova, Chair MacArthur, this is Gordon Howard. In Steve's absence, I will attempt to look at this or answer this. I think I'm actually, like, Steve did provide some comments on this previously to us and indicated that there is an issue here. However, as Sarah pointed out in her report, we are actually proposing a fee that, to our best estimate, given what we have in past history, and that history, as Mr. Rogers points out, is from about 10 years ago now, but it is the history we have, shows that we are proposing a fee that is actually somewhat lower than what we project to be the average fee. If you were to, and Steve in his comments stated he believed that was legally defensible and permissible under the statutory language. If you do have an issue or questions about that, and if Mr. Rogers has made a good point with you, the response would be to make probably that would solve the issue would be, and Mr. Rogers, although he didn't directly say he thought this would do it, he admitted that he thought it probably would be to make whatever the fee we charged a deposit, which would allow for a refund of the, if for some reason the application turned out to be very minor and not require the full amount, then return funds to the applicant. Now, there are administrative costs with doing that, setting up separate accounts, charging time, which are, in fact, you could argue that if you're spending time administering the application, that makes the fee higher for the applicant. So there's a kind of a question there. And also, if you were going to make the be a deposit, which I would answer any of Mr. Rogers' concerns, we would recommend it be higher than the amount that we have recommended, because that amount is actually lower than our projection of the average cost of such a fee. But once again, that's kind of speculation, because Steve, his opinion is that the fee that we have come up with is defensible under that statutory provision.
Yeah, and if it's a deposit, you would also claim for higher, right? You wouldn't just refund. You would also say, the deposit was 12,000, it ended up being 20. You have to pay the difference, right? I presume it would go both ways if it was a deposit.
Commissioner Holova, yes, you're correct. That would be a reason if you made a deposit to make it a higher fee, so that because I think the experience with some local governments do have experience with this kind of a deposit situation, and my understanding is one of the issues comes when the deposit runs out and the local government requires the applicant to submit more money into the fund to finish processing. That's always a dicey situation.
Yes. And can you remind me? I remember seeing that, and I feel like I saw the slide, but now I don't remember. There's an increase for inflation. It's like a yearly, what was the percentage?
Would be determined by the price index each year.
Oh, okay.
If I could provide one other thought on the question of a deposit, I understand the idea that the fairness by charging someone what costs to process their application, because some are more complicated than others. There is an interesting fairness that could go the other way, though, is the first claim in the door is going to take us a lot longer to process, more time, more legal questions, more. As we process several claims that are very similar, the later claims would probably take less staff time. And so the question, it's a question, not an answer, a statement on my part is that fair that the first person pays more and that other people pay less? Or does it make sense that we do our best and set the fee at a reasonable level and folks pay the same? So fairness can go either way on that.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Other commissioners have questions or yes, Commissioner Sandoval.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you could remind me how many claims do we get per year, and then if the fee was to be established, is there like a projection of how that would drop at all?
Who is the right person to answer that? Is that Matt?
Well, so we have not yet received any new claims under the provisions of Measure 49 that cover regulations since the year 2007. I think that's partly because, in fact, well, two reasons. One, we are no longer putting a lot of new regulations on people. Most of the regulations were adopted many years ago. There's not a lot of new regulations. And as you saw yesterday, in a lot of cases, our goal is to provide more housing and not to restrict housing. And then the second is, I think that even where local governments may have considered it, there has been something of a chilling effect that when local governments consider doing something that would restrict residential use, and they realize that this claim process is out there and it makes them think twice. So we have not been receiving any of them. But your question about, a projection, that's a really tough one. It's very difficult for us to know how many claims we might be getting in the future as a result of House Bill 2225. I'm pretty confident it's more than 2. It might be in the 20s. It could be in the hundreds.
Yeah, if I might, there is one additional point too. When you think about claims, it isn't that we're always dealing with claims that actually have merit. People will file claims that just for the sake of, trying to recoup something, or understandably, they may feel frustrated and they file a claim out of emotion. That's their right to do so. But the point is the department will get claims that don't really amount to paying compensation or so forth, but we still have to process those claims nonetheless.
I'm sorry, this is Gordon again. My other thought, Commissioner Sandoval, is that the template dwelling provisions, as maybe Commissioner Lilac as a county planner might know, it can be a fairly tricky business as to whether someone qualifies for a template dwelling under our current rules, much less as they're revised by the statute. So there is kind of I think will be, if we do get these claims, a lot of individualized analysis of the situation for a particular property, because it involves how many houses are around that property within a certain distance, how many lots are within a certain distance, and when those lots were created. There are a number of court cases before the Land Use Board of Appeals I see every 2 months involving forest template dwellings and disputes about those rules. So they will, I think for any claim that we do get, we will need to spend some time to check the validity of the claim, and so that will be a cost.
Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Yeah, Gordon, you're exactly right. Dealing with just rural land use in general is more complicated. I mean, for example, if it were a non-farm dwelling, you need to look at the soils. There's all sorts of different factors. It's not as simple as just saying you can't build a home on a platted residential lot in a neighborhood in a city, something like that. It's definitely a lot more complicated. I guess probably just kind of wrap up my questions, maybe 2 questions are in one. once you have some experience with this, call it the first quarter of next year, assuming that there are some claims filed, and you have a better sense of what the actual fees are, is there the potential you see to correct the fee, either up or down, whatever it may be, based on the actual cost? And for example, I saw that probably the biggest variation, and I'm not asking you to go back to the slide, but potentially the biggest variation was DOJ's time. It looked like there was a flat fee with the staff time was pretty standard, and then the appraisal fee was pretty standard. So just my question is a willingness to go back and correct the fee if it is if it's not correct, number one. Number two, do you see, and I really appreciate Ellen's comment that there could be other regulations that limit other uses, and maybe there's the potential for different Measure 49 fees for different types of claims, because as Gordon mentioned, a template dwelling may have one fee because it's one level of analysis compared to whatever another one dealing with housing may have a different level of analysis or different DOJ time. So potentially a tiered structure in the future, just so that we don't go into this thinking this is what it's going to be forever with this inflationary factor. And then probably my last point or comment is it seems like this conversation deserves some legislative attention going forward in a more robust way, that if there's going to be more limitations on uses, then the legislature needs to know those decisions. And I think, Palmer, you'd already discussed this quite well. They need to understand that, okay, it's going to come with this cost, and how is this cost going to be passed on to either the property owners through their fees, or to subsidize the agency to pay for the appraisals and DOJ and things of that nature. It just seems like there's a bigger, broader conversation at some point. So thank you. That concludes my comments on just the Q&A part.
Thank you, Commissioner Warren.
Yeah, thank you, Chair MacArthur. So this is just kind of a general question from my understanding of Measure 49 a little bit more. And of course, this, wildfire stuff has kind of brought this to my current attention. Here in Phoenix, there's definitely a mobile home unit that was built prior to FEMA mapping of floodplain and floodway. And once it was destroyed, it looks like it's going to be very difficult for this mobile home park to rebuild there. Does the FEMA mapping apply to Measure 49 at all, or is that going to be a different regulation? So, would these folks be able to apply for this Measure 49 stuff based on the flood mapping? Am I off base there?
Matt?
Commissioner Warren, Chair MacArthur, if I say it depends, would that be an unsatisfactory answer? Let me say a little more. So when FEMA adopts a new map or creates a new map, that itself would not. However, the local government, the city or the county, goes through an ordinance amendment process to adopt that new map. And that ordinance amendment process would potentially be subject to this. And so if in doing so, a particular property were affected, the residential use of it were, let me get the right word, is it restricted? Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah, but also if FEMA's mapping is for flood hazard, for health and public health and safety, then no, it would not be subject to Measure 49. Measure 49 exempts any land use regulations that are for public health and safety or required by federal law.
That's helpful. So let me summarize where I think commissioners are. I don't hear commissioners objecting to charging a fee. The real question is what the fee should be. We have the staff proposal on the table of charging $12,500. We hear that it's legally defensible as well, and it was brought up in the RAC and really thought through to be some kind of average to make it as legally defensible as one can and to be reasonable for the applicant. We have that proposal on the table, and then we have the idea of maybe charging a little bit more than the $12,500. knowing that it may or may not be less than that, but offering some kind of refund situation to the applicant should their application only cost, you know, $3,000 or whatever. So they would be refunded the difference between that and whatever fee they initially paid. We understand that has administrative costs, and there's some certainly labor involved, but so that's where I think we are. And so I would appreciate comments, pushback, whatever, so we can kind of get toward a conclusion and deliberate on final language.
Chair, if I may, I'm just going to jump in on that. I support the fee as written. I think that due to the few number of claims that the department's going to be seeing, it doesn't make sense for us to create a really complicated process right now. I think in the future, if we do find that these claims rise and we're seeing, you know, that we're collecting too much money for them, I think it would be possible for us to come back and adjust from there. But I don't think it makes sense for us to create a more complicated process right now for recovering costs.
Thank you. That sounds like a reasonable approach. Other commissioners? Commissioner Lelak.
Thank you. Since we're kind of concluding with deliberations right now, I definitely don't want a fee that discourages people from applying on the one hand. On the other hand, I completely get the agency's budget. This has a real impact on your resources, and there's a direct payment that you have to make for appraisals as well as to DOJ. I work in that world every day with it in my day job. And you have to have that cost recovery. It just didn't, the bill didn't come with the cost recovery measures to have it in place. So I'm gonna support the fee. I can't. I wish that there was more common ground. I wish that Mr. Honeycutt had been and testified here this morning, and that that the RAC had the benefit of his conversation at the time, but that didn't happen. We have the letter. I didn't hear the same concerns to the same level from Mr. Rogers or Ms. Miller. I did hear the concern about going forward and future fees and things of that nature. So I hope we're really careful and cognizant about those potential impacts, and that the legislature understands that. I really appreciate Palmer, Matt, and Sarah's your responses to the questions that I've raised and issues, and those that others that have testified and raised. So that concludes my remarks. I really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hollaba.
I was just going to say, after listening to everything, I would support the staff's recommendation and also Steve's analysis, because that's who we have to rely on when thinking about the legality of these things.
Thank you. Commissioner Sandoval.
Yeah, I also support the staff recommendation.
Thank you. And I think Commissioner Warren already said that, start out. So thank you. I really support the staff recommendation as well. But I also really like the idea of coming back in 6 months, a year, when after we've had, maybe we won't have anything for a couple of years, but after we've processed a few of these, to really think through the fairness both to staff in terms of making sure it covers staff costs, and the fairness to the property owner themselves. So with that, I might call Commissioner's attention to page 6 of the staff report, and it has a recommended motion, and happy to entertain a motion from any of you.
This is Commissioner Warren. I'll make the motion. I move that the Commission adopt rule amendments to OAR 660-041-0520 as recommended in attachment A.
This is Commissioner Sandoval. I'll second it.
Great, thank you. We have a motion and a second. I think at this point, since we've already discussed it, we can just call for the vote.
Commissioner Halova?
Aye.
Commissioner Warren?
Aye.
Commissioner Lilac,
Aye.
Commissioner Sandoval,
Aye.
Chair MacArthur,
Aye.
and Vice Chair Perrine and Commissioner Jacobson are excused.
Thank you, Esther. The motion passes, and thank you to staff and the folks that provided written and verbal testimony. It is really helpful for us to see you in person, well, see you on Zoom anyway, to help us flesh through these questions that we have. So thanks, everyone.
Chair
And
MacArthur,
yeah.
apologies, this is Palmer. I was trying to find the right time to bring this up, but now that the commission's voted, I think you should know that the legislature does get final approval on this fee. There is a process where the legislature has to ratify fees, even fees that are enacted before a legislative session. And so we will have to go in front of our Ways and Means subcommittee, mention this fee, talk about it, and we may get some indication of how the legislature feels about it. So there is an additional step here before our fee is fully effective, and I wanted the commission to know that. So apologies if I didn't say that earlier. I wasn't sure that got mentioned in Sarah's presentation. I just want to make sure the commission had that knowledge.
That's useful to know.
I agree. I just wanted to echo Chair MacArthur. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Warren also.
Yeah, and I just want to provide maybe a little additional direction from my perspective for staff. I know I just speak on my behalf, but I think it would be useful moving forward. And it sounds like Palmer, this is probably your wheelhouse, that when, maybe some new state regulations are coming up, that the conversation around this fee be included in that to the legislators that, hey, if you pass this regulation, that, there may be properties subject to this additional fee and process.
Yeah, no, Commissioner Warren, I absolutely agree. And hopefully the stakeholders have heard that. I had conversations with a couple of them leading up to this meeting today to assure them that I would do that. Yeah, now I understand what Measure 49 is, and I will make sure that I'm looking at that when when the legislature is talking about different bills. So you bet.
That's what happens when you're drinking from a fire hose when you first start on this stuff. So we appreciate that. Okay, because we have been so efficient, staff and commissioners, we deserve a 15-minute break. So we'll.
Chair, if I may, you're about an hour ahead of schedule, and so if you take a break, we have the next scheduled event is at 11:15 for the Farm Forest report. There is, however, a possibility, if Palmer is willing, that we could, before lunch, do both the policy update and the Farm Forest report.
I really like that idea. As long as, I'm just wondering, I think we had people signed up to testify on the policy agenda. So I want to make sure that we can maybe connect with those folks to see if they can tee up a little bit earlier to comment. And maybe there are people on the Farm and Forest as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So seeing nobody object, let's be efficient with our time. So sorry, what?
It looks like Esther has something to contribute.
So I don't currently show any public comment for Farm Forest or for the policy agenda.
Oh, okay, great. I misunderstood that. So yes, why don't we go ahead? Palmer's already in the room. If it depends, you guys decide which order you want to go in relative to whether or not the Farm and Forest report is ready and that staff person can join us. So you can decide that while we're breaking, and then we'll come back and then do it that way. So let's break for 15. So I don't know, Kirsten, do you know what you've decided in terms of staff presentation and who's going to go first?
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. It'll be Farm Forest and then policy agenda in the order shown on the agenda just earlier.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. It is 10:26, and I am showing Commissioners Sandoval, Warren, Lilac, Vice Chair MacArthur, and Commissioner Halova.
Thank you, Esther. And thanks to Hillary Foote for coming on a little bit early. Hopefully that is going to work for you. We're going to draw our attention to agenda item number 9, which is the Farm and Forest report that the department does. I don't know if it's annually or it says biannual. It's a biannual report. And you received both the staff report as well as the 60-page or whatever, 120-page document online. I did not print it out, but I did review it online, and it's very good. So, and the purpose of this is for us to, I think we actually take action on this because it's then submitted to the legislature in March of 2021. And with that intro, I will welcome Hillary Foote.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair MacArthur and commissioners. So I am attempting to share my screen. Share. Okay. And can everybody see that? Okay. So thank you. So there's a lot to cover here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I am going to attempt to be brief and just hit the highlights. But obviously, this is a topic that I'm passionate about, and I could go on at some length. So the state of Oregon has had for almost 50 years now this very dynamic land use program in place to protect working agricultural lands and forest lands. And every other year, the Commission, LCDC, is required to report back to the state legislature on how that program is working out. So DLCD staff, the Farm Forest Specialist, prepares the biennial Farm Forest report for the Commission's review. And I hope you all had a chance to read the full report. I know it's quite long, and it did go out in supplemental last week. But the question for the Commission today is whether you would like to approve the draft report for submission to the legislature, or if there are changes you would like to see integrated into the report. So the report does need to be submitted prior to the start of the legislative session, and that is actually fairly early this year compared to past years. It starts on January 19th. So what that looks like is we will send the report to the chair of the House Committee of Agricultural and Land Use and the chair of the Senate Committee on Environment and Natural Resources and their respective staff. And we will offer to provide a presentation on the report as well, probably a little bit more in depth than our discussion today. And although the legislature is the primary audience for this report, it's actually widely used by a variety of stakeholders. So advocacy groups, researchers, graduate students, and it was prepared with that audience also in mind. Okay. So the report is divided into 6 main sections. Context is important in presenting the data. So there are sections devoted to describing goals, the Goal 3 and the Goal 4 program. So the legislative policy statements that they're based on, how farm and forest lands were meant to be identified and inventoried and then protected under zoning. And then I also attempted to identify the top 2 emerging issues that either really evolved since the 1970s or weren't necessarily back on the radar back in 1973, and then describe how those emerging issues relate to our program and our policies. And then we get into the sections on the statistical reporting obligation. These are the nitty-gritty details on the number of dwellings and non-residential uses and partitions and PLAs that have been permitted on protected working lands over the past biennium. And this is the part that statute tells us we have to do. We also provide some historical context for those, for the data for the biennium as well, so we can understand what those trends look like for the period which we have data. The last section of the report is a discussion on conversion. So how much working land has been converted to residential, commercial, or industrial use. And what DLCD tracks for our key performance metrics and historically has been measured by in terms of performance have been zone changes and UGB expansions. So that information is also included in the report. For this report, I also included other metrics for comparison based on credible data supported by well-documented methodologies. So I provided data from a federal entity, a sister agency, and a conservation not-for-profit on conversion in the state of Oregon. I think it's important and interesting to look at other lenses for assessing how well Oregon is doing as a state at preserving our working lands. And then the last bit is an appendix filled with very detailed data tables. In previous years, a lot of those had been integrated into the body of the report. And although they're included in the report, it's really my hope that anyone who is actually interested in the level of detail captured there would reach out directly, and we can provide custom reports or zoom through how to use our raw data. And actually, DLCD maintains a really detailed database of land use decisions across the state on farm and forest reports that goes back over a decade now. It's an incredibly rich resource, and I really do hope that it could be more widely used. All right, so now we'll hit each of these boxes, and I'll try to briefly touch on the highlights that I really do hope came through in the report as you read it. This is the only text-dense slide, I promise. So I feel bad a little bit about summarizing the agricultural land use policy. 215, 243 is actually one of my favorite things. It was part of Senate Bill 101, which was essentially a wholesale rewrite of Chapter 215. The agricultural land use policy was the centerpiece of that. And this was, obviously enacted prior to the adoption of Goal 3 and is referenced therein. And the legislature, I feel like, really went to town with the 4 sentences that are included there. They're just so rich. And so there's a discussion of that in the report. What I will touch on is the last statement here, which deals with the farmland taxation program, because I feel like this is something that's really gotten lost over the years. And that is that our land use program has always been linked to a compensatory tax program. Exclusive farm use zone land is automatically assessed at its farm value rather than highest and best use. It has to be explicitly excluded from that program, for example, when a non-farm dwelling is permitted on it. And depending on where in the state you live, that benefit can be different. On average, it's about $1,000 per 100 acres per year. And there have been some attempts at quantifying that in terms of benefit as well, and that's addressed in the report. There's a really fun quote from Senator Atiyeh about Senate Bill 101, where he says it was clearly their intent to give some goodies in exchange for the restrictiveness of the farm use zoning. And this is back in the 1970s when there were only 6 uses allowed in the EFU zone. Okay. So moving on, agricultural lands. So in the discussion of agricultural lands, there are a couple of things that I hope got conveyed. One is that when counties originally mapped agricultural lands, the guidance was that those lands to be inventoried were foundationally based on science, on the NRCS soils capability classifications, and the definition of agricultural lands in rural goes beyond that to also include lands based on practices, other localized factors, and necessity for inclusion as agricultural lands. It's a save the best and don't forget the rest policy. And it's very clear that less productive lands were intended to be inventoried as agricultural lands and protected under exclusive farm use zoning if they were interspersed in a large cohesive working landscape. So that policy provided counties with flexibility for a broader definition of agricultural lands, but fundamentally, those inventories are still science-based. The second thing I hope really comes through is that there are a lot of different ways to classify then those agricultural lands in statute and rule. There are several different definitions of high value, arable, suitable for farm use, non-arable. All of them are based on NRCS capability class to some extent. They may reference different certain data sets. For example, for UGB expansion, your definition of high value farmlands at 195/300 sub 10, and the regulatory data set to be used is for basis of fact is from 2007. And there are a lot of regional nuances in those definitions, and it can be really complicated when you're looking at how soils intersect with our program. That said, the program is science-based, so there isn't a lot of gray area. It's pretty black and white. And that means that there's a lot of room in the program to respond to evolutions in science and emerging social concerns. And I particularly bring that up right now because there's a lot of attention on and discussions around healthy soils, the NRCS Healthy Soils Program, work that's being done at OSU, because of its potential for sequestration in soil and in plant matter. So if that science evolves in a way that tells us there are certain lands that are prime for no-till, dry land, or other intensive management practices, we may consider how to include that in the way that we prioritize our agricultural lands for additional protection. Continuing on the climate thing, or on that climate topic, the other salient issue around that is related to water. In Oregon, irrigation acreage has already been declining. And I've seen a couple of applications now that argue that the farmland shouldn't be considered high value or other because they're only class 2 if irrigated, and although they have water rights or are in a district, they're not getting their allotment. So declining water availability and changes in seasonal distribution of water supply are going to have an economic impact on farm operations. And it is important to consider how water might play a more prominent role in how we conduct our land use reviews and in how we prioritize farmland for protections. The other salient topic I brought up was ownership, and this is a hard one. I have struggled with it a little bit. There is a lot of conversation in farm protection groups right now about ownership. Owning agricultural land is a privilege, and it requires a lot of privilege to own agricultural land. Agricultural finance is a beast into itself. It's very difficult territory to navigate. Agricultural succession planning is a huge concern nationwide. These statistics for Oregon on the average age of farmers are true for the rest of the country as well. And it's amazing if you look through the USDA NASS database, how many farmers actually self-report as being in their 80s as the primary farm operator. And as our agricultural operators age, there is we are looking towards that period of transition and how that land changes hands. And so there's a lot of focus naturally on access to land, access to capital for young farmers or beginning farmers, and also experienced BIPOC farm workers who aren't in a position to benefit from intergenerational transfer. However, our program is essentially a conservation program. We don't regulate practices. We don't get involved in civil issues. We should be owner agnostic. We don't get involved with finance. And although there's clearly a relationship, there may be different pressures on our program based on who owns the land and whether or not that land is based on the ownership going to be maintained in farm use or pressured for other types of development. This is an important topic that's worth highlighting. But again, I've struggled a little bit to connect the dots with our program, but I think it merits inclusion in the report. All right, moving on to data. So there's a lot of data, a lot of graphs and charts in the report as well. So one of the things that statute requires us to do is report on the number of dwelling permit approvals issued, use permit approvals issued, and partitions and property line adjustments. So for the dwelling data, for both farm and forest, most of the trends for the past biennium were in line with the 10-year average. And the percent of dwelling types were also consistent with historical trends. And what I find interesting here, though, is what those historical trends look like. So if you look at this graph, which is the percentage of dwelling approvals by type for the biennium, those dwellings that were permitted in conjunction with a farm are these green and yellow ones here. And that's less than 0.25%. And that is true historically as well. So historically, between 94 and 2019, so 35 years, those dwellings that are approved in conjunction with a farm use, a primary farm dwelling, an accessory farm dwelling for farm workers or for a relative of a farm operator, actually more non-farm dwellings have been approved than dwellings in conjunction with farm use. And the largest category of approvals for both for farmland have been for replacement dwellings, which may or may not be associated with farm use. It may once have been and may no longer be when it's replaced, because there's not a requirement that any of these other dwelling types, the replacement, the lot of record, the health hardship, or the non-farm dwelling be in conjunction with an operating farm. Okay. So here's a graph that shows dwelling approvals over time. You'll note in the 2008 recession, those dwelling types that were more closely related to conventional real estate markets declined significantly, the non-farm dwelling and replacement dwellings. And those were the dwelling types that actually rebounded after 2011, 2012 time period, whereas farm dwellings remain fairly constant except for a really bizarre blip in accessory farm dwellings in 2016. Okay. And, as I'm looking at these trends, I'm also wondering, what the future holds post-COVID. It's going to be really interesting. Will the COVID recession put a chill on rural housing development? Or as people get comfortable with teleworking, is there going to be a move towards rural repopulation as people want to telework and teleschool from rural farmettes? All right. And then where those dwellings are being permitted. So these are historical data from 94 to 2019 showing where dwelling approvals are permitted. 3 counties here on the state map, Douglas, Deschutes, and Marion, have the most dwelling approvals, with Douglas having permitted almost twice as many dwellings as any other county in the state. Okay. For the biennium, the top dwelling approvals were Deschutes, Douglas, and Lake. All right, moving on to uses. So as we mentioned earlier, when the program really started, so back when 101 was enacted and Chapter 215 was rewritten, there were 6 uses that were permitted in the exclusive farm zone, and now there are over 60 uses. So one of the things that we report on is all the number of non-residential use permits that are issued by counties as well. For the report, I pulled out those top 5 categories historically over the past decade. And that's pretty consistent with the numbers that we see for the biennium as well in terms of use approvals. So it is interesting to note as well when we get to it, there are 5 times as many use approvals on exclusive farm use land in the past biennium as there were on forest land. So if I spend more time focusing on uses, non-farm uses permitted on farmland, that is one of the reasons why. And because of the sheer volume of uses permitted on farmlands compared to forest lands, they tend to also be more controversial. So top 5 uses, communications facilities, which have been declining in recent years. Home occupations. So these are lots of things get approved as home occupations, but they're supposed to essentially be a small business conducted by the resident of a house, and it's supposed to look like a residential use. So these are like hair salons, firearms dealers, tasting rooms. Auto sales are actually a big one. But the biggest category of home occupations are bed and breakfasts and other types of small lodging facilities. 26% of all home occupations are B&Bs. Winery, cideries, and tasting rooms are also approved as home occupations, and a lot of home occupations are event venues. So 5% of home occupations over the past decade have been events oriented. The other large category here is processing, where home occupations have been pretty stable over the past decade. Processing has increased from an average of 5 approvals per year in the 2009 to 2015 period to over 30 approvals per year in 2016 to 2019, and that is related to hemp and marijuana. So processing means that you're doing something to chemically change or alter farm products that are raised on your farm. So making kimchi or cider or bubble hash. 87% of all processing approvals in the past biennium were for hemp and marijuana. This is becoming a bigger issue. I'm hearing, in my position at the state level, more opposition to local applications for processing facilities as well because of their potential to conflict with residential uses. Hemp and marijuana processing is also approved as commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, or CACFU as we call them, if they can't meet the standards for a processing facility that's allowed outright. Okay. And so hemp and marijuana, actually, processing facilities accounted for, between processing facilities and CACFUs, 15% of all approvals for the biennium. And this example actually shows how difficult it is when you're looking at a particular industry, whether it's marijuana, hemp, wineries, cideries, to really tease out what the impact is, because a lot of these things get approved on different permitting tracts. Another example is a winery or tasting room could be approved as a winery or tasting room under 215, 452, 215, 453. It can be approved as a processing facility. It could be approved as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. I've seen them approved as home occupations as well. Okay. So we talked a little bit, we jumped right into commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, which is another area that gets a lot of attention as well across the state. They are a large use category. They've been fairly stable over the past decade, but again, there's a trend to seeing more marijuana and hemp permitted as CACFUs.
Wineries and cideries are also commonly permitted as CAGFOs when they can't meet the standards in statute at 215, 452, or 453 as well. And then the last category here, which has really also exploded since 2014, is solar. And there's an independent section on solar in the report addressing the concerns with that. There's been a sharp increase in the number of solar projects in the Willamette Valley and high value farmland. And that was a trend that was noted in the 2016-2017 Farm Forest report and continues into this biennium as well. Okay. So in the report, the conversion discussion is at the end of the report, but for our conversation right now, I thought I'd skip ahead and talk about conversion on farmland just for a second before we move into goal 4, while those development statistics and land use policies are fresh in our heads. So again, if you look at the acres that have been maintained in farm zoning over the past 40 years, we've done a really good job. 99% of exclusive farm use zone lands are still zoned exclusive farm use. Of land that has been added to urban growth boundaries, 37% of that was zoned exclusive farm use. So by this metric, and this is what we report on every year, we're doing a really good job. And I think these metrics are also reflective of a past focus in farmland conservation on limiting urban sprawl, and essentially, on limiting urban sprawl. And there has been a recent trend in agricultural conservation communities and a growing concern about trends in large lot rural development as well. So there was a great report that was put out over the past summer. It's very interesting, by the American Farmland Trust. And it is called Farms Under Threat, State of the States. It's part of a multi-year series. It's the second installment of some work that they've been doing. And the first part of it is a policy scorecard looking at the continental United States. They ranked different states based on land use policies and taxation programs and easement programs, etc. Oregon ranked 9th in their policy scorecard, which is great. It's not number 1, so there's still room for improvement, but 9th is pretty good. And that was based on the strength of our land use program. The second part of that American Farmland Trust report was a really fascinating land cover assessment that was conducted by Conservation Science Partners. So it's really the first attempt to classify at the national level agricultural land cover. And so the methodology for that report, that technical paper on the methodology, is like 30 pages long. It was quite an effort. So they categorize the United States into low density residential, urban, pasture, croplands, woodlots, wildland forests, etc. And they compared change in cover, in land cover, from 2001 to 2016, so over a 15-year period. And what they found was that those areas, or those landscapes that were characterized by low density residential development or large lot rural development at the start of the period were 25 times more likely to be converted to urban uses over that 15-year time. For the state of Oregon, they had identified a loss of roughly 65,000 acres in that period of agricultural lands, which is far more than land that was rezoned. Of those 65,000 acres, they identified 32,000 acres, which were converted to
urban densities. And that actually tracks a little bit more closely with the number of acres that we identified as being rezoned and added to urban growth boundaries. Then they also identified 33,000 acres that were converted to low density residential development. And what they mean by low density residential development is rural areas with housing densities at a level that makes commercial agriculture impractical. So that is very interesting. So, but those 65,000 acres that they identified by AFT as being lost in Oregon are actually far less than the number of acres that USDA reported as no longer being in farm use. So USDA runs an agricultural census every 5 years. So it's a census. The information that they collect is self-reported by farmers. But I can tell you from personal experience that they are very aggressive in getting farmers to report on the information. So USDA, for that 1987 to 2017 period, so the same 40-year period that we would report on zone changes, identifies only 90% of agricultural land in the state of Oregon as being retained in agricultural use. So that's compared to the 99.8% that was maintained in EFU zoning. And the map down here looks at land retained by county. So the counties that are white here are lands that retain less than 70% of their agricultural lands as working farmlands, as reported by the agricultural census. And surprisingly enough, there are actually a handful of counties that reported increases in the amount of land in agricultural operation, and Deschutes is one of them. Which is really interesting given the level of housing development there as well. So the conclusion here really, I hope to come across, is that there are other sticks by which to measure our performance in retaining working lands in production. And as we are considering the number of non-farm use approvals, dwelling approvals, substandard partitions that go along with those non-farm uses and dwellings, that are permitted on exclusive farm use lands that are allowed, it makes sense to contextualize those statistics within some other data frameworks. And these are a couple of data frameworks that document de facto decline in working farmland, even though those lands are still protected under exclusive farm use zoning. Okay. All right, moving on to goal 4.
Sharon? I just had a question. I was more curious, I don't know if you have had this with you or maybe it's in the report, the American, I think you said Farmland Report had a ranking and Oregon was 9th. Do you have a sense on who was 1 through 8? Not that you know all of them, but just a sample.
I can pull it up at the end of this presentation. Yeah, I can navigate to it pretty quickly. So moving on to goal 4. Like the goal 3 section, there's an overview of the economic contribution of the timber industry to the state, an introduction to our goal 4 policies, the structure of that program, how forest lands were identified, how zoning is applied to those inventoried lands, and then the data is presented as well. The 2 issues that are addressed in the report as emerging issues of concern for forest lands are climate and wildfire. So there's sections on both those topics in the report. So with wildfire, obviously that's a big topic right now for the state. Our forest zoning significantly limits the dwelling types that are allowed in forest zones. However, as we'll see, there are still quite a few dwellings that do get approved every year on designated timberlands. In 2010, 36% of homes built in Oregon were within the wildland-urban interface, and 80% of vacation homes were built within the wildland-urban interface. And as I'm sure the Commission is well aware, when homes are located in these remote areas at low densities, the cost of fire protection increases. You know, when you have more homes in an area, the incremental cost of protection goes down. When you have fewer, the incremental cost of protection goes up. Right? And there are also different fire control strategies that need to be implemented when you're looking to protect a dwelling than when you're looking to manage a forest fire. There are combustible materials found around residential structures. There's a need to maintain perimeters, etc. And so the presence of dwellings in forest lands complicates firefighting and makes it more dangerous. As you'll see in the graphic over here, compared to other states in the nation, Oregon is doing fairly well on the number of houses that are built in the wildland-urban interface since the 80s. And we can conclude that our land use program has contributed to that. Okay. However, we can also anticipate that, you know, with progression of climate change, population growth, forest fuel volumes at the levels that they are, all of those contribute to a growing wildfire risk in the state of Oregon. And on that last point about climate change, there's also a section in the report for forest lands that focuses on climate and focuses primarily work that was done by ODF on forest carbon inventories for the state. I think one of the just most salient points that's really interesting that I'll highlight here is that 58% of the net CO2 sequestered annually from tree growth occurs in the forests of the Western Cascades and on the coast. And even more interesting is that report concludes that Lane County is responsible for nearly a quarter of all the CO2 equivalent sequestered every year. And that is interesting to me, and I'm going to keep that in mind as I look at this map here, which shows Lane County as the location of the highest number of dwelling approvals in forested lands as well. Okay. All right, we'll move on to dwellings. So like farmland dwellings, forest dwelling approvals for the biennium were consistent with the 10-year average. So there were no big surprises in the biennial data. This past year, we've talked a lot about the template test dwellings and House Bill 2225. And so, you know, we know already that template test approval are the most commonly approved dwelling on forests. And we're excited to see those criteria and those standards for those approvals tightened up a little bit to hopefully prevent some unintended approvals. Last year, though, the legislature also authorized a new type of dwelling approval in the forest zone, and that is an opportunity for a family forestry dwelling. So this is an opportunity for a second dwelling to be established on a parcel that is in commercial forest use that has an existing dwelling. So part of that review is a forestry management plan that's going to be a commission of that dwelling type. So this opportunity became effective on January 1st, 2020. And in 2023, we will begin reporting on those dwelling approvals. Okay.
A quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious what the gap between 2020 and 2023.
So for next biennium.
Okay.
Yeah, since those dwelling approvals are going to start this year. So in 2023, we'll report on the 2020-2021 biennium. Yep. So like farm dwellings, there is a decline in the number of dwellings permitted on forest lands following the 2008 recession as well. All right. And then again, the distribution of dwellings across the state, they're primarily in Lane, Douglas, Jackson, and Clackamas. All right, use approvals on forest land. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 times as many approvals for for uses on farmland as there are on forest lands. And because of the volume, approvals and in non-farm uses approved on forest lands or farmlands tend to be more controversial than those approved on forest lands, generally speaking. And in the past, but yeah, so most interesting things that are going on here really are the agricultural buildings, because that has increased in more recent years. So agricultural buildings are primarily marijuana production, so not processing or like with the farmland, but production of marijuana in those ag buildings. And half of those approvals are occurring in Jackson County. Okay. All right, and so then we'll move on to conversion for forest lands. So again, the same thing. When we look at the amount of forest land that was zoned for forest use in 1987, 99.9% of that is retained in forest zoning. And only 8% of forest lands are added to urban growth boundaries. Right. So by those measures, we are doing very, very well. So for contextualizing forest land conversion, there is a great report the Department of Forestry puts out. They performed a land use cover review based on interpretation of aerial imagery for different years between 1974 and 2014. And based on those reviews, aerial reviews, they categorized non-federal lands into one of 5 resource land categories, or into urban or low-density residential. And their conclusions for that 35-year period are only slightly less forest land was retained in forest cover than was retained in forest zoning. So they track more closely with our estimates for land maintained in protective zoning. However, you'll note that they're also showing fairly significant conversions to low density residential and urban lands. One of the conclusions in their report, though, as well, is that although the land use program is really successful at limiting conversion, they also did analysis of the number of structures on wildland forests and other resource lands and concluded that the number of structures cited on private wildland forests has increased significantly to 4 structures per square mile, with 21% of those structures more than a mile away from low density residential or urban areas. All right. I also need to note that the report concluded that only slightly less agricultural land was retained in agricultural cover than retained in exclusive farm use zoning or the 35-year period. And again, that report concludes that the program has been more successful in presenting conversion than it had been in preventing the proliferation of scattered structures throughout those resource areas. So that might hint at, when do we consider it conversion? When is there a density of structures or dwellings that really tips a community from being agriculturally viable or economically viable for agriculture? When does that happen? That's a hard conversation to have and to look at. So again, a different lens through which to view the success of the program. All right. So I think those are the basic highlights for the program. Thank you very much for the time you spent with us. And I would welcome any comments or additional questions.
Thank you, Hillary. Wonderful presentation and report. Really, really good, solid, data-driven report. Questions from commissioners?
Chair MacArthur.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner Hillary. That was fantastic. And I did. I read every single word. I'm not going to incriminate myself, but I'll just say I wish I had read every single word years ago, because I learned a lot about a lot of issues. In fact, the document appears to have some almost department interpretations of state law, which I think are also extremely informative and really helpful overall. So it was extremely well done. I just finished, I just found 3 super minor typos. So I just sent those to you in an email. So you have those. 2 questions I have. One is, given the age, the increasing age of farmers, do you think that, and maybe this is a better question for the Oregon Farm Bureau, but with marijuana and hemp in particular, but probably more marijuana, are you seeing a lot of younger people entering farming that maybe previously didn't, that then may expand to other crops and whatnot over time? And maybe this is a whole new emerging generation that will be interested and engaged. That's my first question. And my second question is, with the new family forestry dwelling, and I don't deal with forestry hardly at all, so I don't know much about it. Is there any relation whatsoever, and probably not, but to the Measure 49? It's really not Measure 49, but to that House Bill 2225, the template dwelling, where that restricted some, may restrict some dwellings. This actually adds another dwelling to that. Is there? I just don't know if there's any relationship to that at all. Thank you. Those are my 2 questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Lelak. So on your first question, I don't have data statistics for the average age of marijuana and hemp farmers, and I can certainly ask Dave Loesch, who is the USDA statistician for our region, about that. And Sunny Summers over at ODA runs their hemp program, and she also might have some statistical data to support that. I can tell you anecdotally that at farm conferences, the age of folks involved on seminars on hemp and marijuana, actually there's quite a range of folks interested in that type of production or learning about that type of production. And I will follow up with Dave and Sunny and ask for that information if you're interested.
Please don't do any extra work on. I know you're already married. I just was curious if you just maybe knew anecdotally. That's all.
No. So many things came up for me in reading this report that I was like, oh, I would love to go dig into that a little bit more. I'm like, oh, I've got 100 little side projects to do in my spare time now. But on your last question about the family forestry dwellings, that is a completely new and separate dwelling type. So the changes that were made by House Bill 2225, those were specific to the forest template test provisions. So they don't apply and they're not related to the family forestry dwelling.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other commissioners have questions?
I have a question, Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Sandoval.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, yeah, thank you for a wonderful report. It was really, really eye-opening for me. And thank you for including the racial characteristics. So, so the Latino population, the ownership seems to be at 3%, which is much higher than other ethnic groups, which is interesting in itself. But still, I forget what the population was, but it was like 90-something%. Anyways, so I guess my point is, I started thinking, okay, so you kind of got into these issues about what role, like what can we do in terms of land use to increase like potential ownership. So I thought about that, and I said, well, is it really about, could it be about farm size? Could it be about like the kind of use of farm use? So for example, I did a research project in Eastern Oregon where I was looking at Latino sustainable farms. And so it was interesting because a lot of the activities that they were doing were kind of like, they were informal activities. They weren't really formal. So they'll own like a small ranch, and then they'll grow like organic, food and organic, raise organic beef and so forth, and then, kind of sell that to family and friends. And so I guess my point is that I think there's a lot of opportunity there, in terms of increasing the amount of, Latino farm owners. And I would like for us to think about what we can do as a land use agency to do that. So that's one of my points. And it makes sense. Most of the Latino immigrants to Oregon are coming from Mexico. That's kind of changing, but most are coming from rural areas. So I think there's something there about that. The other thing relates to sustainability. So I notice a lot of most of the Latino agricultural workers are obviously farm workers, but I think there's a potential for them to start doing more kind of sustainable agriculture. And a lot of that has to do because of the risks and so forth that they know about when it comes to working in the land. So, so the other point, sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I have a point. The other thing has to do with sustainable agriculture. Okay, and I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about, is there like a formal indicator or formal categories that we can measure within the report that can speak to the amount of sustainable agriculture that exists in Oregon? So I guess those are the two things. One is, how can we increase, and I don't expect you to have answers to the first one, because it's a pretty tough question. How do we increase Latino ownership in terms of farms? Like, what can the agency do about that? And then two is there some sort of indicators we can use around sustainable agriculture that we can highlight more in the report? And then three, my point is that I think there's an opportunity there around increasing Latino-owned farms and sustainable agriculture. So,
yeah, everything that you brought up, Commissioner Sandoval, are fascinating topics, and they are really timely topics. And there's actually a lot of conversations going on in the agricultural community about that, about sustainable regenerative agricultural practices, and and about increasing diversity in agricultural production. Because actually, if you compare our farm ownership statistics nationally, for some reason, like, we actually have a slightly lower percentage of white ownership than nationally, which is 99%. I think one of the challenges that I'm running up against in both of these areas with the land use program is that I feel like there's definitely a goal-to role in facilitating accessibility to the program. But the fundamental issues with access to land and access to capital and making that available for persons of color are structural issues. And there are groups out there that are working on increasing access to capital, facilitating access to land, helping folks navigate those systems. Because honestly, like, land is where wealth is, and that is your means of production if you're a farmer. There's a lot of land that's leased out there. That is another really interesting conversation as well. I could talk about this for half an hour, because when you lease land, but maybe I won't, because I'm getting outside of my role as the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for DLCD. So maybe instead I'll highlight some resources. For farmers of color, communities of color, National Farm Farmers has a really amazing racial equity toolkit. They just, yesterday was the last day of their national convergence. I believe those presentations are going to be made available online, and most of the convergence this year was on facilitating access and raising up voices of people of color in the farming communities. There are a number of groups locally that are working on those issues as well. Adelante Mujeres, Raíces, there's some groups that are doing a lot of good work here. I can put my head together and come up with a list for folks who might be interested in that. On the regenerative sustainable agricultural thing, for our program, the challenge there is that we are actually statutorily prohibited from regulating practices. We are statutorily prohibited from regulating farm practices and from forest practices because practices are regulated by Department of Ag or Department of Forestry. And this is actually coming up in the land use arena, particularly when in some recent comp plan amendments, where I think, there is a general desire, to see comprehensive plans addressing practices, and that's just something, that currently right now we can't do. There are conversations going on. What is sustainable agriculture? What is regenerative agriculture? How do you qualify for carbon offset credits? Those conversations are happening on Tuesday night. This is actually a really great week. Cultivate Oregon had a workshop on regenerative soils classification. ODA spoke and NRCS spoke, as well as some other folks, Southern Oregon, what is it, SOCAN, some folks from California came as well. I'm sure that presentation will also be available, but there is a lot of effort going into putting metrics around what is regenerative, what is sustainable. There are a number of folks out there trying to develop certifications for regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture. And I think that our biggest nexus with that kind of work, again, is through the fact that our program is soils based. And so as the science evolves, as that work evolves, if there is some sort of consensus, probably coming from ODA or NRCS on what set of practices or soils look like, then that is something that could be interesting to look at how it'd be integrated into our definitions of high value farmland, or create a new definition like sequestrable carbon farmland or something like that, right? But there's that potential there because of that structure in our program.
Great. Yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to get at.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very good. Thank you.
I rambled on. Sorry.
No, question, very thorough answer. Palmer, you wanted to say something. Is that what I understood from the text I got from Casaria?
I was going to respond to Commissioner Lelak's question about the forest dwelling secession bill, but I mean, I can talk with him offline. I don't want to take us back.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to get you sooner. Commissioner Holova.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this conversation we're having right now, because I noted in your presentation, you talked about owning farmland as being a privilege. Mm-hmm. And I've sort of got me in this whole thought process of it. Obviously, it is a privilege now. And, it started to make me think, is it a privilege inherently, in the system and the structure that's set up? And obviously there's a lot of factors that go into that. And, the whole conversation I've been trying to think about, like, what can be our role in, is it access to information or knowledge or opportunity, or like, what can we do to think about how not to make it like so, in the sense that also owning urban real estate or land has also been a privilege. And it was a privilege because we were prohibited, we weren't allowed to own land, right? So it became a privilege by mandate, let's say. And so now we're all in a position to help reverse these kind of structures that have been set up. So there's no conclusion to what I'm saying. I was just like, oh, it's a privilege, and inherently that means that there isn't access to ownership for the Latino community, for example. And so it made me think about this report and if, what is our role with regard to disseminating the report and getting feedback from other organizations like some of the ones you mentioned, or, and if it's feedback, or is it maybe just like they have knowledge of what, kind of an update on where our system is currently. And so have you tried to solicit feedback from some of those organizations you listed that are BIPOC related? And also I was thinking of folks like EcoTrust, and other people that exist outside of the governmental realm, but would be interested in these topics.
So as far as soliciting feedback on the report, unfortunately, we had a couple of counties who weren't able to complete their reporting, their data reporting until mid-October. And so we haven't conducted much in the way of outreach on the report to anyone, to be perfectly honest and clear about that. As far as general engagement and outreach, I think your suggestion is really, really interesting. How do we collect feedback from a wide audience on what barriers our program poses to people of color or other marginalized people, as far as engagement or developing what it is that they envision to be developed. And, I would love some help in thinking about how we could, do that more proactively.
Deputy Director Green, you wanted to say something.
I could. I don't want to interrupt Commissioner Halava's kind of line of inquiry there. Commissioner Halava,
I had two other things, but what you're going to say probably relates to what I just said, so you probably should go.
Well, I just Dr. Rue may want to weigh in here as well, but we're not alone in our shared interest in this arena, and so there are folks at the Governor's Racial Justice Council who brought this up as well. So would just like to kind of widen the circle a little bit with the Department of Agriculture and their response, and members of the Racial Justice Council who are actually farmers of color that sit right on that council. They're very interested in this topic as well. So Hillary, thank you for raising it and providing a space for us to talk about it. And I think Jim and I both are supportive, and also would like to link in with the Department of Agriculture. I would think they also have some programming and outreach programs that are probably underway, but it's a learning opportunity to partner on that.
Yeah, and because my expertise and knowledge and stuff isn't more in urban areas, like obviously I push hard for that. And I just want to make sure that it gets done also in rural communities, So when I look at should we move to submit this to the legislature, I'm like, should we? If nobody from all communities have given feedback, should we follow kind of a normal course of action, or should we, and I'm not trying to be like money and resources, but at least go through some steps that maybe we haven't gone through in the past before submitting it. So I don't know where we are on the, oh my God, we need to submit it now because it links to this or that. But it just seems like it's a missed opportunity, because we're talking about another biennium, to not address this, given our critical junction.
One way to think about this is that to me, the report it does raise issues, but it's really data driven. And that's what's so great about it. It's a sound document on its own. I'm wondering if we're not necessarily soliciting input on the report itself as much as where do we go from here. So it's a transmittal letter that might highlight these things and ask for input on these kinds of things we're talking about. I'm also wondering about the opportunity when we do transmit this and message it and transmit it to the legislature, Do we do that in concert with other groups, especially other state agencies, in particular, in this case, maybe it's ag and forestry? And are there some collective emerging issues that we want to bring to the attention of the legislature?
Yeah, and I think depending on what community you're in, you might have a need for different sorts of data, right? And Commissioner Sandoval said a bunch of things that were really interesting, and it made me go, maybe there's some other data that somebody wants that's not in there because they're coming from a different perspective about what data is necessary or should be included or should be reflected on. And so, because this is not my area, I don't know what one might want in actual data from a community of color that focuses on rural farm or forest issues. And so that's what I meant. Not that there's a conclusion drawn, or it's more that people want different sorts of data, right? To serve their, or to support, or to highlight their purposes. And I don't know what's missing because this is not my area. But if we don't ask the people, then we don't know. The other thing that I was more curious about was, it's interesting how we're focusing on climate change with regard to urban, housing and development. But it seems as if the sustainable, I understand not regulating practices, I totally get that. It just was interesting how, we're like climate, and we're over here talking about climate, but it sounds like not so much on the land use side for ag and forestry. So I thought that was an interesting, kind of strange.
Although I thought Hillary hit upon the sequestration issue relative to farming.
Yeah.
You're thinking more different kinds of issues than that?
I don't know. I heard about the sequestration, and that's when it made me think of EcoTrust, because I know EcoTrust is thinking about some of those issues, sequestration specifically. It seemed like, just from the presentation, it seemed a little like we're more hands off on the climate change issue when it comes to these lands versus we're very active on the urban climate change issues. So
I think Kirsten, you had something else to say, and then Palmer.
Right. Thanks. I'll let Palmer address that for the governor's executive order. Palmer, you could talk, but thank you. But I wanted to just point out for commissioners, Commissioner Sandoval and Commissioner Haliva, other commissioners, that we are starting to ramp up to this 50th year of the land use planning program that Director Rue mentioned yesterday. And I know Hillary has an interest in that. And so I would invite us to actually start to identify issues and opportunities around that celebration. And, this is a major pivot, right? 50 years, major milestone. So like, what are we seeing heretofore? And then what are opportunities going forward? Could be a very significant issue to flag. And I support Commissioner Haliva's suggestion that we do, use this opportunity as a moment of dialogue. And Hillary, I don't know if you have the bandwidth to even call together a webinar sort of before the January submittal of some stakeholders on this, just for a discussion and a presentation of kind of what you went over today. But it's germane, it's relevant, and the data is there to suggest the importance of a deeper dialogue. So thank you.
And then the last thing I want to say was more a curiosity thing. Because I know we did visit some commission meetings ago when we were in person, and they had I think it was there, maybe it was when I was on a board of 1,000 Friends, a robust discussion on the marijuana issue just in general. And so when I saw the marijuana, the buildings associated with marijuana processing or different types of facilities, and I saw it in both ag land and forest land, I was just more curious about, does our land use system care if these processing happen on ag versus forest, or is there some sort of positioning on the types of buildings in those two different categories?
So for production, so can you build a enclosed indoor grow operation? That's farm use. It's considered farm use, like growing corn or growing basil or growing wasabi. So, it's a use that's encouraged in forest zones and in farm zones. and in most rural residential zones as well. For processing, that is different. That's a use that is allowed outright on farm zones. So that, involves that chemical change. So for marijuana and hemp, like if you're making CBD oils or hash, you would get your facility approved. You get a site plan and review approved essentially for that processing facility as long as 75% of the product processed was grown on site. If you can't meet that standard, then it gets kicked up and it goes into a conditional use review process, or what we call at DLCD a sub 2 use for commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. And so if you were, gathering hemp and marijuana from other producers and processing at a facility, you would need that CACFU permit. And when you get approval for that sub 2 use, you need to demonstrate that there's not going to be a significant impact on surrounding farm operations or the cost of surrounding farm operations.
And then what about in forest land, the processing?
On forest land, there's not really an opportunity for a processing facility.
Okay, maybe I read that pie chart wrong then. For some reason, I saw marijuana. I thought it was processing in forest land, and I was like, "That's interesting." So that's what made me think about that a bunch.
No, those are for, and it's interesting because that's a big chunk of agricultural buildings that were permitted. So those are going to be those production facilities. So those indoor grow operations.
Okay.
Thank you. And then Palmer, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, if I could, I'd just circle back to Commissioner Alova's question about looking at climate on our resource lands. And so Kirsten mentioned it very quickly, but I guess I'll elaborate. The governor's executive order does direct the Global Warming Commission to work with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Forestry, and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, OWEB, to try to set some goals for carbon storage and sequestration on our working lands, which is broadly defined farm, forest lands. While we weren't mentioned DLCD in that executive order, we've started to partner with those agencies in looking at whether goals could be set for, again, storage and sequestration, and how that might be done, the right methodology, the right goals. Is that a legislative decision? Is that executive action? Some of those policy issues. That project isn't due until June of 2022, I think. I think I have that right. Hillary can maybe correct me if I'm wrong on that. So it does have a long lead time, but there is some action. Then the other thing I would mention is here at the department, we were focused on the question of climate and our land use planning goals, including our rural goals. We had, as I think you know, Commissioner, a project that we were going to start this fall, to start reaching out to stakeholders and taking some input and start to dig into these questions that the commission's asking now. But when the legislature did the rebalancing cuts during the August special session, we lost the staff that was leading that project, and so we've had to defer that. But I guess it should just be known, and I think the commission does, is that the staff very much agree we should be digging into these questions, we should be looking at. We just haven't had the resources to really lift the project in the way that it deserves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other comments, thoughts from commissioners? So I might, again, thanks to Hillary and everybody. We do need to take a motion on it, but before we do that, I might turn to you, Deputy Director Green, about some of the follow through on these things. I know it involves Hillary's time, and perhaps you need to connect with her outside of this setting to figure that out. But there's some really good ideas about how to outreach to some non-traditional communities to broaden the scope and the review. I also am aware of the fact that there's so little time between now and March when I think you have to submit it, or no, I guess the beginning of the legislature, that I guess from my perspective, I'm not necessarily requesting, and I'm not trying to plop on Commissioner Halival, I'm not necessarily requesting that new data be developed for this particular version, but my thought would be that gather information about how to do it differently next time, but also we don't have to wait for 2 years to gather that data and then bring it back to the commission. So if that's an acceptable sort of a little change from what you were suggesting, Commissioner Heleva, I'd like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I was just thinking, there's a lot of push, at least in the city of Portland, and I'm going to use a small example in the Black community to get better data, because with that better data, then you have the ability to go and say, here we have a problem, or here we have an opportunity either for funding or so that's the opportunity I don't want to miss for the communities that are affected and that have the ability to kind of state their case, whatever it may be. They need the data to support that. And we have the ability to do that. So it doesn't have to be, given the constraints, I understand, but I don't want to lose that. Data is not neutral. It's collected for a purpose. And I just want to make sure everybody has the ability to contribute toward their interests.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And we're in total agreement about that. It just was the timing on this particular report.
Yeah, I get that.
So Deputy Director Green, thoughts about that moving forward in terms of next steps with this?
I mean, really, thank you, Chair MacArthur and commissioners. It's a really exciting topic, and we appreciate Commissioner Sandoval and Commissioner Heleva opening it up for us. And I think, Hillary, thank you for just using the word privilege, because I think it piqued all our ears, and it should. We've spent a lot of time talking about historically marginalized communities and systemic racism. This is a place that can show up. So thank you both for everyone for helping kind of open that up for inquiry. I would echo Commissioner MacArthur's suggestion that we move today and submit by the deadline. One of the reasons Hillary has had to work, frankly, feverishly to pull this together for this commission meeting is that we don't have another commission meeting before that, the beginning of the legislature, and to stay within statutory compliance. We've actually asked Steve Shipsey, DOJ, for his interpretation of this, hoping that we could have brought this to you in January and still submitted kind of on time. But to stay safe and within the bounds, it's better to, if commissioners find it reasonable, to move today, but also to take other actions. So Hillary, just putting you on the spot a little bit. I can't see your face and read your body language and how much you'd cringe at this, but I also would support this kind of idea of a webinar. Now that commission, thank you, that commission has received the report and asked it to be forwarded to the legislature. But saying that, I can think of stakeholder groups. There's a Black Food Sovereignty Coalition. There's other coalitions. You've mentioned, Commissioner Sandoval mentioned some, Hillary, you mentioned some, that could have a really great interest in this, and just to start that relationship building around both the data and the access to the economic benefit that are provided by working lands. I think it's a very healthy discussion and timely as I mentioned, as we come up to renew the land use program in another 3 years. So that's all I had. Very grateful for the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would also want to go back to the idea that when this document does get transmitted to the legislature, I'm wondering about the possibilities of having some kind of transmittal letter that pulls out these very themes we're talking about, as well as some of the other themes relative to loss of farmland. And my big one in the past has always been, we give farm tax deferral to non-farm uses in EFU land. And it'd be great if the price tag of going to a non-farm use in some of our best farmland in the world, making that conversion to a non-farm use, if that came with the penalty, so to speak, or the right sizing of a tax benefit, so somebody would have to pay full taxes for that. So that's been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. That may not be ripe, Jim, and I would look to a call to you, but I'm thinking about issues like that we could raise in our transmittal letter to the legislature. Your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, quickly. It raises this whole issue of that the legislature tried to visit probably 5 or 6 years ago and ended up running into a buzzsaw of so-called ecosystem services, how we value them. Obviously, sequestration is huge when we think about ecosystem services, but there are a whole range of other things related to water quality, wildlife, things that we don't do a very good job of valuing. And in fact, there was a proposal, as I say, 5 or 6 years ago, to begin to compensate landowners for those ecosystem services, to give them another stream of revenue. It ran into the buzzsaw of property rights and anti-government types who thought that it was just government sticking their finger in other people's business yet one more time. But as we think about sequestration, I think it begins to change the conversation a little bit.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think we are ready. Again, thanks, Hillary, for the great report. And I think we are ready for a motion. This requires a motion from the commission to transmit this. And there's a sample motion on page 3 of agenda item 9, the staff report.
I'm happy to make the motion. Ready?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. I move that the Land Conservation and Development Commission submit the 2018-2019 Farm Forest Report to the Oregon Legislature.
Thank you. Do I have a second? If somebody's seconding and they're on mute, could you unmute? Thank you, Commissioner Warren. So we have a motion by Commissioner Lilac, a second by Commissioner Warren. Esther, can you call the roll?
Yes. Let's see. Commissioner Ahalova. Commissioner Sandoval.
Aye.
Commissioner Lilac.
Aye.
Commissioner Warren.
Aye.
Chair MacArthur.
Aye.
And Vice Chair Pearmine and Commissioner Jacobson excused.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously with those folks that are present. Wow, really, really great stuff. And I'm very excited about the conversation that we had around it. So thanks for commissioners on that. And I look forward to more conversations on this in 2021. I'm going back in time. 2000.
Thank you, commissioners. I look forward to continued conversations as well.
Super. So we are teed up potentially to just go directly into the policy agenda conversation or have lunch beforehand. You'll have lunch either way because we still have to get to our executive session. But what is the preference of commissioners? Do you have another hour that you can make it before lunch? I'm seeing yes from most folks. Okay, great. Let's go for it. Palmer.
Good morning, Chair MacArthur and Commissioners. Palmer Mason with DLCD. I will actually try to be hyper efficient here and do this in less time so we can all get to lunch sooner. Let me see about sharing the screen and pulling up the presentation. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this agenda item 10, the revised policy agenda, is building upon the conversation that we had at the September commission meeting where you all received the draft policy agenda which included the updates on the work that we've been doing around policy for this biennium 2019-2021. And we got quite a bit of public comment at the time. Staff went back, considered the staff considered the commission comments, direction, public comments, and I'm bringing now this revised policy agenda to you that will take us through the rest of the biennium through June of 2021. So I want kind of an overview of what we'll try to accomplish this morning is a quick update, and it will be very brief on the revised policy agenda. There's only one new policy project to discuss, and it's actually one you all are quite familiar with. And we could talk about the comments that we received on the policy agenda. There were only 3 of those. And then as a last item, see if there's any additional commission direction, and if you all are satisfied with the revised policy agenda, some sort of approval action from the commission about taking this forward. So that's our goals for this morning. Kind of a quick recap here. There were 4 sections to the policy agenda. These are the 4 different types of policy projects, work that we've completed. And we have some reason to celebrate. We've yet completed some more work on House Bill 2003. So kudos to the commission and to staff for that. And then another set of policy projects were the ongoing ones that we're doing. And you can see for those first 2 categories, no changes from the draft policy agenda that we discussed in September. And then under the new policy project, there's one that I will talk about, and then for deferred, we're recommending no changes from the draft policy agenda. The one new policy project that has been added is the work on wildfire and natural hazards recovery rulemaking, the temporary rule that the commission adopted in October 22nd of this year, and then the additional work that we will undertake for a more permanent rulemaking that will start next year. So that's the one difference really between the draft policy agenda and this particular one from the commission today. Moving on to public comments, we received a comment from a member of the public, and honestly, it was a bit hard for me to tell exactly. I don't think his comment was just about the policy agenda. I think it was about DLCD reports in general. And he asked some things I think are very understandable, that the agency really try to use more plain language, less use of acronyms, try to think about how people who aren't as well versed in land use and our issues can try to access the reports. And by doing that, it'll, I think, give the public confidence that it isn't like a decision's already been made, that you're really seeking meaningful public input. And I think our response is staff is generally well aware that our land use system and the work that we do and the vocabulary we use is a barrier for people trying to engage on our issues, and we make ourselves available to try to help people understand the issues and try to access the work that we do, but we could probably always do better. And so it's a good comment, and just have to continue to try to work at making the work we do more accessible to all kinds of folks. So that was one comment. I'm actually going to skip comment 2 because I think that may be one where we get some discussion. And then this other comment here, this third one here, goal 5 was a comment from the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and the Siuslaw Indians. Their concern was that under the current process and criteria we have under goal 5, that the department and the commission aren't really stepping up to see that local governments are doing an adequate job of protecting important cultural and natural resources that matter to the tribal nations. We've had a couple of different conversations with the tribe about their concerns. We've committed to having more, but unfortunately, we don't have any additional resources to try to go further than what we're doing now. I'm not saying that there aren't some things we can do in the short term, but I think we're not going to be able to fix their or address their real issue in the way that they had hoped. That would require more resources to do more extensive work on whether it's additional rules under Goal 5 or other kind of audits of what local governments are doing and possible enforcement actions. But again, we've committed to the tribe to have continued conversations around this issue. It is an important issue. It's just one that we're not able to do more at the moment. So. And then on this other comment, resource lands, this is a comment that you all have heard at other commission meetings, not just this one, but I think the main issue here is that the department has been asked by several local governments over the years and some stakeholders to look at defining non-rural or non-resource lands. These would be the type of resource lands where, for whatever reason, the productivity for agriculture or forestry is deemed low, and could those lands be used for other purposes? And so local governments have asked for more guidance, at least, and preferably rulemaking from the department on how you identify those lands, and then what the appropriate zoning standards and other land use regulations are for those type of lands. Deschutes County, the county commissioners submitted a letter on this particular issue asking the department yet again to take action. They expressed some frustration because of repeated delays and the fact that this policy project has been continually deferred. So that's the essence of their comment. Our response is that we've reached out to the county and indicated we want to talk more about the issues, and we're willing to talk maybe about some things that we could do that might be specific to Deschutes County. We haven't yet had those conversations, but we're hoping to try to do them. I think right now the current goal is in the first part of next year or sometime early next year. But I'll stop and see if Kirsten wants to add anything. We also have John Jennings on this particular Zoom meeting in case there are technical questions about rural resource lands.
If I may start that, it's kind of an introduction to anything that John would say. John and I in particular, and I'm sure there are other people in the department who really struggle with rural resource lands because we know that the state is different county to county, and that the issues are different county to county. And it is an area where there's a great deal of uncertainty, and uncertainty at its worst breeds resentment and suspicion. But at its best, it still makes it difficult to make clear decisions. And so I think we really, really, really want to do this, but things just keep coming along that bump it to sort of secondary consideration. And this current biennium is a perfect example. When we got the governor's executive order now, Palmer, I don't know when it was, a year ago, maybe less, it changed everything that we did in terms of much of our, I don't want to say surplus time, but flexible time. And certainly all of the rulemaking on housing and transportation have affected it as well. And I guess the last thing I would say, it goes directly to capacity. As you know, during this current biennium, we're experiencing roughly a 1/3 reduction in our capacity through the remainder of the biennium. Palmer at one time had 3 people working in his policy group. It's now Palmer because Sadie and Emma are on job rotations because we couldn't afford to pay them. And it really is just that simple. We don't have the people, we don't have the capacity for technical assistance. And so we find ourselves in this really unfortunate place of saying we can't fit it in unless something changes in terms of resources available. I think I will stop there and let others weigh in, but not doing it doesn't mean we don't have an interest. We are just in a time where, frankly, we've lost a little bit of control over our own agenda, whether it's because of COVID or wildfire or other things. So thank you.
Chair, you might be on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. I just noticed that. So thank you, Director Rowe. It's really useful to have that perspective in considering the policy agenda and the limitations that we have. We'd like to do everything actually, and do it well, and do it as well as we are doing housing and climate change, but it just isn't going to happen. So appreciate your perspective. Question, Mr. Jennings, would you like to say anything before we ask commissioners for questions, or what would you like to do?
No, so thank you, Madam Chair. All I would say is I agree entirely with Director Rue's comments. Personally, I've advocated for this type of rulemaking since at least 2002. I've appeared before the commission in Enterprise, Oregon, and Albany, Oregon, and Condon, Oregon, and this is where we are. No one, I don't think in the program would like to see this more than I would. I cannot, in good faith or good conscience, suggest that we move forward at this time, which would mean putting aside very important work that we're already scheduled to do. So thank you, Madam Chair. I'll go ahead and mute myself now.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Questions, comments from commissioners? Commissioner Lilac, I thought you might have something to say.
Yeah, thank you, Chair MacArthur. Let me start by saying I think it's admirable that the department even asks for public input midway through the biennium on this. It's a big deal that you clearly, I think, this is my first time really reviewing all of these reports. In my day job, in my county planning director job, I always read them, but I hadn't ever spent as much time as I do now, of course. And so I think it's really fantastic that you even have a public comment period on this midpoint. Of course, you do it at the start of the biennium. That's point number one. Number two, just in full disclosure, obviously I work for Deschutes County. Our Board of County Commissioners has been involved in this for a long time, but I'm not going to go there. I'm not here in a Deschutes County capacity. I'm here in a very different capacity. I really appreciate the comments that were just made by Director Rue and certainly John, and I see it's also reflected in the Farm and Forest report that counties have requested the rulemaking or guidance in some capacity to provide clarity on these very important issues for a long time. And I certainly understand the department's resources.
Were you done, or did we just lose something?
I'm sorry, it moved off to the side of me right there. I just wanted to say I certainly recognize that the department's down 34% in the budget. John, you're the expert in all of these issues, and your time is critical for the wildfire now and going forward. So I guess just my question, given everything that's been that we've just discussed, is there any capacity for the department, totally recognizing that rulemaking is just not in the cards for this year and maybe beyond, any guidance that the department might be able to provide counties? It's not just Deschutes County, as we can see from these reports and others, and you've mentioned any guidance that or any help that the department can provide counties that are considering this going forward, this biennium or next, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Commissioner Lilac. A couple of thoughts. The first is that there is a body of work that we began to develop during the Southern Oregon Regional Pilot Project. And some of you remember it and others of you do not, but we don't need to spend a lot of time on it now. But over the course of, I think it ultimately was 3 to 4 years, we probably invested, we got money from the legislature, general fund money, and my memory is that it was somewhere north of $500,000 over the course of at least 3 years, perhaps 4. And so this is a resource intensive issue, but there is data that can perhaps be used that can inform what is the point of my ramble here. We are willing to invest in a guidance document for counties on what they can do today under current law and regulation, because that's not always clear to everybody. And so I think that Gordon and Hillary, and to the extent that John can help out, and probably Scott and certainly Josh LaBombard probably doesn't have a moment to contribute to this given what he's doing in the Rogue Valley for fire recovery. But Josh has forgotten more about this subject than I will ever know because he led the Southern Oregon pilot project. So we have some internal capacity that we can pull together quickly without too much time and too much money and try to get something out. I'm not going to make a commitment to when, spring, early summer, perhaps, I don't know, but we can and will do that. And as you suggested, Commissioner Lilac, maybe we're not going to make a trip over the hill to go see new Commissioner Chang. We wish him best. And maybe we can set up a virtual meeting with him and maybe others on the commission shortly after the first of the year.
I think that's extremely responsive, and I appreciate it. And again, I don't want to focus on Deschutes County. I think pulling together a document, as you suggested, would certainly be beneficial to counties in general, and maybe it's not even with Deschutes County, but it's with AOC or something of that nature. At some point next calendar year would be really, really terrific if the department is able to pull that off, given the limited resources. So that concludes my comments on this. I appreciate everything. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to make, I just realized one additional thing that probably is helpful. I said at the outset that every county is different. The Southern Oregon Regional Pilot Project had sort of a gating condition that 2 of the 3 counties, Jackson, Josephine, and Douglas, needed to agree on a path forward in order for any one of the 3 to be able to move forward on the work. Jackson and Josephine could not come to agreement with Douglas. Douglas wanted to go a fairly aggressive way on their own. And so that threshold condition was not met. And that's why even after $500,000 or whatever it was and years of people's time, we didn't get a result. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a body of work there.
That's, Jim, that's a really important thing to reflect on. And I don't think all the commissioners, in fact, probably most of the commissioners weren't on the commission when we were sponsoring that whole thing. But yeah, you're right about that. Shows you the diversity of interests by county and probably even within each county on what they want out of the non-resource land conversation.
Is there an ability, Chair, just to give 2 sentences, Jim, Director Jim Rue, on when you say aggressive versus the other folks, just an example, more out of curiosity.
Sure. And I go by Director Jim all the time. Douglas County has, for a very long while, and we haven't heard from them recently, but for a very long while has advocated for rural residential housing developments for what they call the rural lifestyle. And they back it up with data from realtors in the county and others who say that they simply don't have enough 5 and 10 acre parcels for people who want small farms or farmettes or whatever you want to call them. And so there was a very concerted effort to recategorize farm and forest land, what we by statute consider to be farm and forest land. They wanted to recategorize for rural residential. And they had a fairly elaborate plan on how they would go through that with concentric circles of 5 acres and 10 acres and 20 acres around urban centers. But their initial ask was to basically rezone close to 100,000 acres in the county. I think it was 90,000+ acres we thought that was a stretch. And that's what I mean when I say aggressive. The other two counties had far more modest requests, and Commissioner Lilac has been breaking his pick on this issue in Deschutes County for as long as I've known him, and he had hair when I first met him.
Thank you for that. Because coming into it, I didn't know if we were talking about residential or commercial or industrial, and that gives me a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it nearly always comes down to residential development outside of urban growth boundaries.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Other questions or comments from commission members? I don't see any other hands up. I just wanted to say I do like the approach that the department is offering up on the non-resource land issue. I like the idea of some kind of a tool for the counties to understand the issues more and figure out ways to respond. And also the outreach effort with Deschutes County commissioners. I really applaud that and encourage it. So thank you. On this agenda item, I have conflicting information in front of me. I don't know if it's an action item or a thumbs up or what. So can somebody set me straight? Palmer?
I'm happy to try. I'm not sure I really know either how this works, because I haven't been through that many policy agendas. I think what we need is just confirmation from the commission that the policy agenda, as provided in the staff report with this addition that we just talked about developing some guidance for rural resource lands. And I might, if I can, add the caveat, see if Director Jim, as he's now known, agrees with me, is that we would initiate the guidance process in this biennium. I don't want to necessarily, I think he, as he said, commit to an outcome by say June of this year, but we can add that additional project in. And if that is what the commission agrees to, then I think we just need a motion to say, as provided in the staff report with this additional project or something to that effect. But I don't really know. I'll defer to Kirsten and others.
I think if I may, I believe, Jim, go ahead. I don't believe a formal vote is needed.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think as long as there is a general sense of the commissioners that you approve of the agenda going forward for the next, whatever it is, 7.5 months, then I think we're good.
I like that, and we'll do a thumbs up or down in a second, but I do like the Palmer's suggestion that there would be a slight amendment to this to reflect our conversation about the guidance document for non-resource lands. And you don't have to have dates or commitment, but I like the idea of having this particular document, when it gets circulated the next time, it actually includes that provision to be responsive to the issue.
And just to be clear, that for me, the caution on giving a date is obviously John needs to be involved, but Hillary's core to this. And I just heard us piling a bunch of stuff on Hillary's plate from the last agenda item. And so I want Gordon and Hillary at least to be able to sort out between themselves what her time availability is going to be and how she's going to be balancing some of these demands.
I think that makes total sense. And so perhaps that conversation should happen among the folks that will be doing the work, and then they can tailor the words in the revised policy document accordingly.
Chair MacArthur, if I may, this is Kirsten.
Yes.
So I think, we do publish the report, publish the updated policy agenda on our website. So why don't we make that available to commissioners as that's finalized with these changes reflected?
It's fine with me. I'm looking at other commissioners. I'm assuming it's fine with them. They understand the direction we've given to staff. So thank you, Palmer and everyone, not only for the report on everything we're doing, but for everything we're doing, actually. So everything you're doing. So thank you for all that staff effort and attention to detail. I'll look around to a thumb motion, and I'm going to go ahead and offer my thumbs up, and looking to other commissioners perhaps. Great. I think we have everybody on there. Great. Yep. Thank you. So it passes with 5 thumbs, and thank you. And
thank you.
Thank you, Palmer, very much. Let's see, I have, let's see, we have a lunch break, which I am going to suggest that we take and maybe be back at 1. That would give you 45 minutes. I can do it shorter than that if that's the direction of the commission. But at this point, though, I think, and correct me, Esther and others, and Casaria, I think I can close the general meeting of the Land Conservation or the public meeting of the Land Conservation and Development Commission for November. And the reason I believe I can do that is we don't have any items to discuss under other business, which is item number 12, and we don't need the placeholder for requests for appeal, which means the remaining item this afternoon is our executive session discussion, which will be in private. And so if that is all correct, and I can officially, I'm looking to Kasari in particular, I can officially close this part of the meeting, I will do that for November of 2020.
And just one comment, Chair. So yes, you're exactly right about where you're proceeding. It's my understanding that Council Shipsey is otherwise detained until 1 o'clock. So we might want, maybe just to be clear that he's with us, or to be sure that he's with us, you might consider waiting until 1:15, but that's your call.
I think we should wait until 1:15. I want to make sure that he is part of that. I think it's required, actually. So yeah, so you have a nice luxurious break today for lunch in contrast to yesterday. So enjoy, and we'll reconvene. First of all, I'm closing the public part of this meeting. We'll have lunch and reconvene in the executive session at 1:15 today. Thank you.
Thank you.